Ancient Egypt, a civilization of wonder and mystery, was also a land of hardship and struggle. As you drift off to slumber, perhaps curled in a cozy bed or stretched out on a soft couch, take a moment to ponder. What corner of the globe do you call home? What hour has struck on the clock where you now lay your head? Whether it's the witching hour or the first blush of dawn, I bid you welcome. If you enjoy voyages into history, tales told in soothing tones as you slip into dreams, I encourage you to subscribe. There are many more stories to come, but tonight our focus turns to the trials and tribulations of life in ancient Egypt. It's a time that looms large in our collective imaginations. Soaring monuments, golden-masked kings, and the secrets of mummification have long held us in thrall. Popular media paints a romantic picture of this distant age, of pyramids glittering under the sun and nobility draped in fine linen and glittering jewels as they cruise down the Nile. And while Egypt's accomplishments were indeed staggering, the precision and scale of the Great Pyramids, the sublime artistry of their temples and tombs, the sophistication of their writing and astronomy, we must remember that these marvels were built on the bent backs of multitudes. For every pharaoh lounging in opulent palaces, thousands of Egyptians toiled in fields, labored in workshops, and fought in wars. Their lives were often difficult, dangerous, and short. In the unforgiving environment of the Nile River Valley, existence was precarious. The annual floods that irrigated their crops could just as easily wipe out villages and seed famine. The same blazing sun that baked the bricks of majestic monuments also scorched the laborers who stacked them ever higher. From the lowest servant to the loftiest scribe, life in ancient Egypt was fraught with adversity. So join me as we peel back the curtains of romance and nostalgia to reveal the stark realities faced by the men and women who built and sustained this dazzling civilization. We'll explore 6 key aspects of Egyptian life that made survival a constant struggle. The oppressive social hierarchy, the grueling demands of forced labor, the ravages of war, the dangers lurking in their own homes, the specter of sickness and injury, and the ever-present sting of grief as they buried their dead. Along the way, we'll delve into individual lives and stories, putting human faces to the grand sweep of history. We'll witness mighty pharaohs confronting crises that threatened the very foundations of their authority, yet also humble craftsmen and farmers striving to provide for their families against formidable odds. While we'll encounter suffering and injustice, we'll also marvel at the resilience of the Egyptian spirit, a spirit that endured for 3 millennia. So, make yourself comfortable, dear listener, and let the cares of the day slip away. The Nile is rising, the sun is climbing over the distant cliffs, and there's work to be done. For life in all its beauty and brutality knows no bounds in this realm of shifting sands and ageless wonders. Let us embark on our journey with the very thing that made Egypt's triumphs and tragedies possible. The river that has always been its lifeblood and at times its greatest peril. The mighty Nile has long been hailed as Egypt's greatest blessing. It provided the fertile black soil and abundant water that allowed a sophisticated civilization to flourish in an otherwise harsh desert. However, living at the mercy of the river's cycles could be a harrowing experience. Each summer, the Nile would surge over its banks, swollen with monsoon rains and snowmelt from distant mountains. The floodwaters engulfed the surrounding fields and pastures, obliterating boundary stones and landmarks. Farmers, gripped by anxiety, watched as the murky tide approached the threshold of their mud-brick houses, fervently praying to the God-fearing to halt the deluge before it could obliterate their homes and livelihoods. However, they desperately needed that flood, as it carried tons of Ethiopian silt to rejuvenate their fields for planting. In a favorable year, the inundation would recede by autumn, leaving behind a thick layer of black, fertile mud. Farmers would sow seeds into this rich soil, reaping bountiful harvests of wheat, barley, and vegetables to sustain their bellies and fill their tax coffers. But the Nile was capricious. Sometimes the floods were meager, barely wetting the parched landscape. The crops would wither in their furrows, casting a shadow of famine over the valley. On other occasions, the river would surge excessively, drowning seedlings, livestock, and villagers unfortunate enough to be caught in its roiling path. The very first pharaoh of a unified Egypt, King Nahma, learned this harsh lesson around 3000 BC. According to legend, one summer the Nile flood failed miserably, shrinking to a trickle between its sun-baked banks. Crops withered, herds of cattle wasted to the brink of death, and his subjects began to starve. Narmer must have watched in mounting dread as the river receded further, the prospect of losing his newly established kingdom to drought and famine growing with each rainless day. He ordered prayers and sacrifices to the gods, even commanding that a young virgin be held into the Nile as an offering. Despite these efforts, the river continued to shrink. At last, in desperation, Narmer embarked on a pilgrimage to the island of Elephantine, a traditional center of worship for the god Hapi. There, prostrating himself before the deity statue, Narmer vowed to dedicate his realm and his reign to the Nile's everlasting glory. He implored Hapi to bless Egypt with his waters once more. Whether through divine intervention or fortunate timing, the rains finally arrived. The Nile swelled to its banks, delivering Egypt from disaster. However, Narmer would not be the last pharaoh to learn the hard way that the Nile's bounty came at a price. This lesson was felt most acutely not in the halls of power, but in the humble villages along the riverbanks, where the annual floods could determine the fate of prosperity or ruin. The harsh realities of life in ancient Egypt extended to their beliefs about the afterlife. The Egyptians were deeply obsessed with death and the unknown that lay beyond. They believed that upon death, their souls would embark on a perilous journey through the underworld, facing fearsome monsters and perilous tests before hopefully reaching the paradise of the Field of Reeds. However, even this reward was not guaranteed. The deceased's heart would be weighed against the feather of Mahat, the goddess of truth and justice. If the heart was found heavier than the feather, burdened by sin and unrighteousness, it would be devoured by the demon Ammit, a terrifying beast with the head of a crocodile, the front legs of a lion, and the back legs of a hippopotamus. To be consumed by Ammit meant to die a second death, vanishing into oblivion for eternity, never to reach the afterlife. As a result, Egyptians devoted immense energy and resources to ensuring a successful passage to the next world. Tombs and burial chambers were meticulously prepared and stocked with grave goods, including food, furniture, jewelry, and servants, all the necessities and luxuries they would need for eternity. The walls were adorned with spells and inscriptions from the Book of the Dead, serving as guides and protectors for the deceased on their perilous journey through the underworld. The most crucial step in this process was mummification. Egyptians believed that the soul required an earthly body to return to in the afterlife. Therefore, after death, the corpse underwent an extensive embalming process to preserve it for eternity. The internal organs would be removed, the body dried in salt, and then wrapped in layers of linen soaked in resins. Even for the wealthy, this sacred rite was an expensive, lengthy, and intricate procedure that could last up to 70 days. For the pharaohs, no expense was spared in safeguarding their eternal life. Perhaps the most extravagant example was King Tutankhamun, the renowned boy king who ruled in the 14th century BC. Despite his unexpected death at the age of 19, he was still interred in a multi-chambered treasure-filled tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Over 5,000 precious objects were buried with him, including 6 chariots, thrones, jewelry, statues, furniture, clothes, and weapons, not to mention the magnificent nested coffins and golden death mask. When Howard Carter finally unsealed Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, the dazzling golden treasures captivated the world. However, they also reflected the Egyptians' relentless efforts to secure their fragile chance at eternal life. And Tutankhamun was just a short-lived minor king. Imagine what must have been buried with the great pharaohs like Khufu, Amenhotep III, and Ramses II, who ruled for decades. Sadly, most of their tombs were looted in antiquity. The precious grave goods were stolen, the mummies were destroyed or scattered. Even King Tutankhamun's tomb had been infiltrated by robbers twice before its final sealing was sealed. The fear of tomb robbery was a constant and haunting presence that plagued the Egyptians. They ingeniously concealed entrances, false doors and passages, deep shafts, and decoy chambers to thwart thieves. Armed guards were stationed, and priests made daily offerings to the deceased kings. Elaborately worded curses were carved, invoking the wrath of the gods on anyone who dared desecrate the tombs. And with good reason, the punishments for grave robbing were among the most brutal in Egyptian law. Convicted tomb raiders faced horrific executions, and their bodies were denied proper burial, thereby condemning their own hopes for the afterlife. The ancient Greek historian Diodorus Siculus recounts the grim tale of the funeral of Ramses II around 1213 BC. Diodorus recounts that during the procession, the king's son noticed a thief tunneling into the royal tomb. Instead of stopping him immediately, the prince allowed the thief to continue, intending to capture the entire gang in the act. When the trap walls sprung, the thieves met a gruesome fate. Diodorus describes the king's orders. The robbers should be promptly executed to deter future attempts. They were placed on skewers and roasted over a slow fire, serving as a chilling warning to anyone who dared cross the sacred boundary between the living and the dead. Even the vast hidden cemeteries and secret tomb shafts in the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings couldn't prevent the robberies. During the reign of Ramses IX in the 12th century BC, tomb raiding became so prevalent that the king dispatched a special commission to investigate. A scribe named Amun-Panifer was sent to inspect the royal tombs and returned with a disturbing report of widespread looting. Amun-Panifer discovered the mummies of great kings and queens of the past cast out of their coffins, dumped ignominiously on the ground, stripped of their jewels and amulets. Their unwrapped corpses lay twisted and decaying, prey to rats and jackals. Even the mummy of the mighty Ramses II had been vandalized, with his onyx and precious stone eyes pried out by greedy hands. The investigators rounded up numerous suspects, ranging from lowly stonecutters and woodworkers to the mayor and high priest of thieves. The confession of one gold worker named Amun-Panifer revealed the sheer audacity of the tomb robbers. He admitted that they tunneled into the corridors of the tomb of King Sober-Saf, found the king's mummy adorned with gold and numerous jewels, and stripped off the gold, jewels, amulets, and ornaments from both the king and his wife. We set fire to their mummy cases and stole their furniture, which we found with them vases of gold, silver, and bronze. Despite the risk of divine retribution or gruesome execution, the robbers were undeterred. The golden allure was simply too tempting in a world of such scarcity and hardship. Even the sacred sleep of the pharaohs could not be undisturbed. Perhaps the Egyptians' obsession with death was well-founded. They poured their hopes into the afterlife because their reality in this life was often brutally unforgiving. For kings and commoners alike, the spectre of death loomed large and constant. Mummification was a desperate grasp at immortality, and the lavish tombs served as a priceless insurance policy for a peaceful eternal rest after a lifetime of toil and uncertainty. However, not even the mummies were safe from the relentless hardships of life along the Nile and the long hand of grave robbers. The afterlife was the ancient Egyptians' only refuge from the cruelties of this world, and even that was a gamble not all would win. But Tutankhamun at least rested undisturbed for over 3,200 years until Howard Carter made his famous discovery. Now, the boy king lives again, immortalized in an exhibit seen by millions. He is a gilded relic from a harsher age. As we drift off to sleep tonight in the comfort of our modern lives, we can appreciate the immense distance between our world and theirs and marvel at what the Egyptians endured in their eternal quest for life, everlasting on the shifting sands of the Nile. Life in ancient Egypt was fraught with uncertainty, hardship, and brutality. Even for powerful pharaohs like Thutmose III, who reigned in the 15th century BC, danger and struggle were never far away. Thutmose III was one of Egypt's greatest warrior kings, leading at least 17 military campaigns during his reign. He fought relentlessly to expand Egypt's empire and secure its borders against rival powers. During this period, the Egyptians' most formidable adversaries were the Canaanite city-states located in modern-day Syria and Palestine. After decades of escalating Canaanite influence, Thutmose III, the pharaoh, deemed it imperative to confront these formidable foes. In the spring of 1457 BC, he led his armies out of Egypt and into Canaan, determined to engage in battle. However, this campaign proved to be a perilous and arduous endeavor, even for a pharaoh. Thutmose and his men endured grueling marches through the scorching Sinai Desert, where water became scarce and heat exhaustion took a toll on their strength. Upon reaching the hill country of Canaan, Thutmose discovered his enemies poised at the city of Megiddo. The Canaanites had assembled a formidable coalition army comprising thousands of infantry and hundreds of chariots. They held a strategic advantage, with the steep slopes of Mount Carmel providing protection for their flanks. Thutmose faced a crucial decision. He could opt for the safer route, marching around the mountain and avoiding the enemy's strong point, thereby allowing them time to escape. Alternatively, he could take the riskier path, a narrow and winding mountain pass that directly led to Megiddo. This would involve squeezing his entire army through a tight canyon, making them vulnerable to ambush. In a bold and daring move, Thutmose chose the direct route. As the Egyptians navigated through the pass, the Canaanites launched an attack. Arrows, slingstones, and boulders rained down from the cliffs above, striking men and horses alike. The narrow defile transformed into a deadly battlefield. Despite the chaos and the heavy casualties, Thutmose urged his army forward. Eventually, they managed to pass through the gauntlet and emerged onto the plain in front of Megiddo. There, they encountered the Canaanite coalition in an open battle. The clash was prolonged and bloody, with intense fighting between the chariot forces. However, Thutmose's military prowess and the unwavering determination of his soldiers ultimately secured victory. The Egyptians routed the Canaanites and pursued them to the city gates. Thutmose later boasted that his enemies were scattered like chaff before the wind. He boasted of personally capturing 340 enemy prisoners and seizing over 2,000 horses and nearly 1,000 chariots. The Battle of Megiddo was a decisive victory for Thutmose, but the larger war was far from over. The surviving Canaanites sought refuge behind the city's formidable walls. Thutmose laid siege, but his men were hungry and battle-weary. Megiddo's defenses were strong, and there was no quick way in. So Thutmose ordered his men to construct a massive wooden palisade around the entire city, trapping the defenders and cutting off any chance of escape or relief. It was a daunting construction project. Thousands of trees had to be felled and transported. The Egyptian troops worked tirelessly for weeks in the scorching heat and dust, encircling the city with an impenetrable timber barricade. Trapped inside, hunger and disease soon began to take their toll on the Canaanites. The city's food stores dwindled and people started to starve. The will to resist gradually weakened. After 7 long months, Megiddo finally surrendered. Thutmose entered the city triumphantly, claiming its riches and taking its rulers captive. It was a significant victory, but one that came at a steep price. The siege of Megiddo showcased the hardships and brutality of ancient warfare, even for the victors. During the prolonged months of encirclement and bombardment, Thutmose's men faced short rations, sickness, and enemy raids. They were far from home, camped in enemy territory, uncertain if they would survive to see their families again. Even in triumph, they had to contend with the aftermath: rotting corpses, devastated fields, and the haunting memories of close combat. Such was the cost of creating and maintaining an empire. After Megiddo, Thutmose would go on to conquer numerous Canaanite cities, extending Egypt's dominion all the way to the Euphrates River. However, as his power grew, so did the strains on his country. Endless campaigns meant that farmers were taken away from their fields and artisans from their workshops for months or years at a time. The flow of tribute from conquered lands enriched the royal treasury, but it didn't necessarily improve the lives of the common people. In fact, the burdens of empire often fell heavily on those at the bottom of the social ladder. The constant need for manpower led to an increase in forced labor and conscription. For the average Egyptian, being drafted into the army or a royal work gang was a deeply traumatic experience. It meant leaving behind family and home, marching hundreds of miles on foot, and enduring the dangers and drudgery of military life. Hand-to-hand combat was a terrifying prospect, but so was falling victim to dissension or heat stroke. For many recruits, the greatest danger was simply being worked to death. We get a glimpse of this reality from ancient sources like the tomb inscription of Amenbe, an army officer who served under Thutmose III. Menameb recounts the hardships of campaign, from crossing crocodile-infested rivers to marching through wind-hipped desert sandstorms. He describes a gruesome battle against the Nubians in which his unit had to clamber over piles of enemy corpses to storm a fortress. In another gruesome passage, he tells of how Thutmose ordered the severed hands of slain foes to be piled before him as a grim accounting of the day's killing. Such ghastly tallies were par for the course in Egypt's wars of conquest. After one campaign, Thutmose had his scribes catalogue the various body parts he'd harvested from the battlefield. 1,692 hands, 29 penises, and so on. These were the bloody receipts of empire used to proclaim the king's power and intimidate his enemies into submission. However, they also reflect the pitiless brutality of the age. For those caught up in the gears of the pharaoh's war machine, life was often nasty, brutal, and short. Of course, it wasn't just soldiers who bore the brunt of imperial aggression. The inhabitants of conquered lands were also treated with great cruelty. Cities that resisted were burned, their people murdered or enslaved. Prisoners of war were subjected to brutal beatings, torture for information, and often executed to instill fear and send a clear message. This is evident in a passage from the Annals of Thutmose III, which recounts the fate of a rebellious Canaanite ruler. Thutmose III captured the city of Joppa and seized its chief, his wife, his children, and all his possessions. He then razed the city and sowed it with barley. As for the chief, he hung him up in front of the city that had once been his. Thutmose III's actions served as a stark warning: defy the pharaoh, and you will face the most horrific consequences. Such terrifying spectacles were designed to instill obedience through sheer fear, and for many of the oppressed people of Canaan, they were remarkably effective. The yoke of Egyptian imperialism would cast a long shadow over the region for centuries to come. Despite the long list of triumphs of Thutmose III's warrior king, the average Egyptian saw little benefit from all this bloodshed. Most remained trapped in poverty, working as peasant farmers or laborers on state projects. The magnificent monuments built to glorify the kings were often stained with the sweat and blood of the impoverished. Even during times of peace, life was a constant struggle for survival, and this struggle began from the moment of birth. For an ancient Egyptian child, the odds of reaching adulthood were incredibly slim. It is estimated that as many as 1 in 3 infants perished before their first birthday. Those who managed to survive infancy faced a harrowing gauntlet of malnutrition, accidents, infections, and parasites. Only about half of children lived past the age of 5. The evidence of this is found in the cemeteries of ancient Egyptian villages, where tiny graves are heartbreakingly common. Childbirth itself was fraught with danger for both mother and child. Without modern medicine, many women died during labor due to hemorrhage, eclampsia, or obstructed birth. Midwives employed various spells and ritual techniques, which likely did little to improve outcomes. If a baby became stuck in the birth canal, the mother's life was prioritized. The fetus might be dismembered in the womb using sharp instruments to facilitate extraction, a horrific practice that was nevertheless a common last resort. Even royal women were not immune to these dangers. Several of Thutmose III's wives and daughters, including his eldest daughter Nephura, are known to have died during childbirth. The grieving pharaoh had to bury his child in a lavish yet tragically small sarcophagus in the Valley of the Kings. Such infant and childhood mortality was so prevalent that Egyptians often refrained from naming their babies for the first few months of life. They feared becoming too attached to a child who might soon perish. From birth to death, the specter of loss and suffering loomed large. For bereaved parents, the experience was undoubtedly traumatic and left a profound imprint on Egyptian culture. The Egyptians believed that the deceased needed to be provisioned for the afterlife. Therefore, even the youngest children were often buried with miniature combs, pots, and toy figurines. These poignant grave goods reflect the effort to care for the child's spirit, even after death had cruelly intervened. In some cases, infants were mummified with the same lavish care given to adults. We know of a case from the city of Huara where a young mother died in childbirth alongside her baby. Someone took great pains to mummify the two together, posing the infant at its mother's breast as if peacefully nursing. It's a touching scene, but also a tragically common one. The fact that the Egyptians developed such elaborate mortuary practices for children speaks to the omnipresence of child death in their society. Those children fortunate enough to survive infancy still faced numerous perils and hardships. Most were put to work at a very young age. assisting in the fields, tending livestock, or learning a craft. Education was a rare privilege, limited to the children of the elite. For most commoners, life was a constant struggle to avoid hunger, pay taxes, and meet the demands of their overseers and landlords. This precarious existence could be disrupted at any moment by uncontrollable events. The Nile's annual flood, once the lifeblood of Egyptian agriculture, was both a blessing and a curse. While it provided fertile land for crops, it could also be devastating. If the waters rose too high, entire villages could be submerged, drowning people and livestock. Conversely, if they receded too quickly, the crops would wither, leading to famine. Even a slight fluctuation in the flood's timing could spell disaster for thousands. One such famine is recorded in the inscriptions of the noble Anktifi, who lived during the tumultuous First Intermediate period. Anktifi describes a time of soaring grain prices, rampant looting, and starving peasants from the north invading his province in search of food. Despite his efforts to feed his own people, he was forced to turn away the hungry hordes who would eventually succumb to starvation at his feet. The entire land became like locusts, relentlessly searching for food. Villagers would come to his territory with their children on their backs, desperate for grain to survive. Anktifi, fearing the wrath of the king for their unauthorized migration, would bury those who died on the road out of fear. For these hapless refugees, dying on the roadside from hunger was apparently preferable to returning home and facing the king's wrath. The First Intermediate period was a time of unprecedented strife. However, localized famines and food shortages were distressingly common, even during the best of times. Pests like locusts and grain beetles could devastate harvests, consuming up to a quarter of the crop in a bad year. Moreover, the pressure to hand over a significant portion of their harvest to the state left many farmers on the brink of subsistence. For peasants, hunger was a constant companion, and the threat of losing everything loomed large. Many individuals fell into debt during challenging times and were compelled to relinquish their meager plots of land to powerful landlords. Court records reveal an unending series of foreclosures, resulting in whole families being taken into bond servitude when they failed to make their payments. These debt-ridden individuals were treated like any other property, capable of being bought, sold, rented out, or bequeathed. Their dependent status left them with limited recourse against abuse and exploitation. Even for Egyptians who owned their own land, the demands of corvée labor could be overwhelming. During the flood season, when they were unable to farm, peasants were frequently conscripted to work on the pharaoh's monumental building projects. This forced labor was intended as a form of indirect taxation, but it often devolved into outright slavery. The work was grueling, involving the heavy lifting of mud and stones under the scorching sun. Men succumbed to exhaustion, crushed by falling blocks, or simply worked to death. The human toll of this labor is evident in the ruins of the workers' village near the Giza pyramids. Skeletons discovered there exhibit severe arthritis, particularly in the lower vertebrae, indicative of extended hours spent bending under heavy loads. Many have fractured limbs that healed crookedly, a testament to inadequate medical care. One poignant burial site contains a couple still holding hands, united in death as they likely were in life's hardships. Despite these humble remains, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of care and humanity. Graves were meticulously dug, and offerings were placed to provide sustenance for the deceased in the afterlife. These offerings included prized tools, bead necklaces, or chunks of meat wrapped in linen, intended to sustain them eternally. Family members who could afford to mummify even a small portion of their loved ones would often do so, carefully removing the organs and desiccating the body before burial. These practices reflect the profound human desire to honor and remember their departed loved ones, while simultaneously shedding light on the harsh realities of the workers' lives. In one mass grave at Giza, Egyptologists discovered the remains of a woman clutching her infant child amidst the skeletons of laborers. Both had evidently perished on the job, bearing the marks of malnutrition and physical strain. They were nameless cogs in the pharaoh's grand machine, worked to the brink of collapse, and then buried with minimal ceremony in the shadow of the monuments they sacrificed their lives to construct. Thus, despite its glories and wonders, life in ancient Egypt was often harsh, brutish, and short, particularly for those at the bottom of the social hierarchy. They endured constant struggles against the elements, endured backbreaking labor, faced hunger, disease, and a rigid hierarchy that confined them to their positions. Even many nobles and priests led lives of surprising frugality, constantly vying for position and favor, always at risk of losing status due to the king's political or supernatural displeasure. Perhaps that explains why, despite their reputation for conservatism, the Egyptians exhibited a remarkable fascination with the transgressive and chaotic. The tombs of the elite are adorned with images of animals and humans engaging in bizarre and unnatural behaviors. Cats harming geese, mice waging war on cats, animals acting as humans, and humans as animals. These scenes are often humorous, yet they also evoke a world turned upside down where the established rules of May or cosmic order have crumbled. One darkly comic papyrus satirically portrays the gods as a quarrelsome and petty group getting drunk at a banquet and hurling insults at one another. In this inverted vision, the sun god Ra casually orders his divine guests to be flayed and their skins used to make a pair of sandals. Such irreverent stories allowed the Egyptians to safely transgress the sacred order. Imagine for a moment a different reality, not bound by the often pitiless logic of M. Even the Egyptian concept of the afterlife bears the imprint of their uniquely precarious existence in a world where starvation and death were always close at hand. The field of reeds offered an inverted mirror image, an idealized landscape of lush crops and eternal bounty where no one ever went hungry or suffered pain. However, this afterlife was not guaranteed. It had to be earned through proper observance of rituals and obedience to the gods and the king. Even for those judged worthy, the path to paradise was harrowing. The deceased had to undertake a perilous journey through the underworld, evading lakes of fire, pits of snakes, and the slavering jaws of the monstrous devourer. They had to recite the right spells and muster a small army of protective amulets and figurines. Only then could their hearts be weighed on the scale against the feather of truth. If it balanced, they were admitted to the field of reeds. But if their heart was heavy with sin, it would be tossed to the abyss. The Egyptian civilization is also renowned for its remarkable medical knowledge and practices for the time. The ancient Egyptians had a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of the human body and developed advanced treatments for various ailments. However, despite their progress, Egyptian medicine was still quite primitive by modern standards, and many procedures were gruesome orals for patients. Much of what we know about ancient Egyptian medicine comes from a fascinating document known as the Edwin Smith Papyrus. Dating back to around 1600 BC, this ancient medical text details 48 surgical cases and provides incredible insights into the practices of Egyptian physicians. One particularly striking case describes a complex cranial surgery performed on a patient with a severe skull fracture. According to the papyrus, a man was brought to the physician with a compound comminuted fracture of the skull. In simpler terms, this meant the unfortunate man had a crushed skull with numerous bone fragments. The ancient surgeon meticulously examined the wound, probing the fracture with his fingers to assess the extent of the damage. In a procedure that would make even the bravest among us cringe, he painstakingly extracted the broken bone shards from the man's head using primitive surgical tools. It's important to note that this surgery was performed without the benefit of anesthesia or sterile techniques. The patient endured excruciating pain and the risk of infection, which is almost unimaginable. Despite these challenges, he miraculously survived the procedure. The Edwin Smith Papyrus further describes how the wound was disinfected with honey and bound with fresh meat as a kind of pus. Miraculously, the patient recovered, and the papyrus states, "Thou should say concerning him, one having a gaping wound in his head, penetrating to the bone and perforating the sutures of his skull." While this story undoubtedly showcases the skill of ancient Egyptian surgeons, it also highlights the brutality patients faced. In an era devoid of pain relief or antibiotics, even routine medical treatments were often excruciating. Egyptian physicians relied on various primitive remedies such as burning, leeching, and bloodletting, which undoubtedly caused immense suffering. The Edwin Smith Papyrus contains numerous other harrowing cases that reveal the harsh realities of ancient medicine. Alongside the cranial surgery, it details procedures for treating crushed vertebrae, broken collarbones, and deeply lacerated flesh, all with rudimentary tools and techniques. It even includes a case of a patient who was kicked by a horse who almost certainly died from his injuries. However, beyond the Edwin Smith papyrus, archaeological evidence paints an even more bleak picture of Egyptian public health. Studies of mummified remains consistently reveal evidence of fractured bones, abscessed teeth, and nutritional deficiencies. Parasitic infections, tuberculosis, and malaria were rampant. Even non-elite Egyptians who were mummified exhibited high incidences of worn joints, spinal deformities, and healed traumatic injuries, indicating lives of ceaseless toil. For the average ancient Egyptian, life was harsh, brutish, and short. If disease, malnutrition, or injury didn't claim their lives, they faced the prospect of drastic medical interventions that were barely better than the ailments they treated. It's sobering to consider that even the basic comforts we take for granted today, such as painkillers or antibiotics, would have been unimaginable luxuries for our Egyptian ancestors. Despite these challenges, the ancient Egyptians persevered. Through trial and error over centuries, their physicians developed a vast body of practical medical knowledge that surpassed other ancient cultures. They could set broken bones with splints, suture gaping wounds, and even perform basic surgeries. In some ways, the story of ancient Egyptian medicine serves as a testament to human resilience and ingenuity in the harshest of conditions. However, it also serves as a powerful reminder of how far we've come. The next time you suffer from a cough or a cut, take a moment to appreciate the incredible advancements in medical science that enable us to treat such ailments swiftly and painlessly. Consider our ancient ancestors who endured far greater hardships. The gleaming scalpels and sterile wards of a modern hospital would appear almost magical to an Egyptian physician working thousands of years ago. As we've explored in this series, life in ancient Egypt was challenging for individuals across all social strata. From the oppressive heat and unforgiving environment to the threat of war, disease, and social inequality, hardship was an ever-present reality. By modern standards, the living conditions and daily challenges faced by ancient Egyptians were almost unimaginable. Despite these hardships, they constructed one of the most enduring and captivating civilizations in human history. Over the course of over 3,000 years, their struggles and triumphs left an indelible mark on the human story, captivating us to this very day. Perhaps there's a lesson in this, a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit, even in the most dire circumstances. As we conclude our exploration of ancient Egyptian history, take a moment to reflect on all we've learned. From the grandeur of the Great Pyramids to the humble huts of the impoverished, we've endeavored to present a vivid portrayal of life in this legendary ancient land. The reality we've uncovered is often harsher and more challenging than our romanticized notions. However, this reality also amplifies the remarkable achievements of the Egyptians. The next time you gaze upon the majestic mask of Tutankhamun or the towering pyramids of Giza, I hope you'll perceive them in a new light. These wonders emerged from a world of struggle and strife that we can scarcely comprehend. They stand as enduring testaments to the grit and greatness of a fascinating civilization that, despite immense adversity, reached for the stars. Thank you for joining me on this journey through ancient Egypt. Although our time here was brief, I hope you found it both enriching and engaging. History is replete with remarkable stories waiting to be discovered if we only take the time to listen. Even an era as distant as Egypt's ancient kingdom still offers valuable insights into the human condition and our shared past. And with that, our Egyptian adventure must come to an end. However, the annals of history beckon us with their remarkable tales, eagerly waiting to be shared. I hope you'll join me again soon for another captivating journey back in time. Until then, this is your dedicated history guide, bidding you good night and sweet dreams of pyramids and pharaohs. Take care, and I'll see you next time. The life of a pharaoh may appear glamorous and carefree from our modern perspective. It's all about gold, glory, pomp, power, entertaining subjects, and monumental building projects that immortalize their names for eternity. However, the stark reality is that even these god-kings at the pinnacle of Egyptian society could face a brutal end. Consider the mighty warrior Pharaoh Thutmose III, who ruled during the affluent 18th dynasty in the 15th century BC. Thutmose was an aggressive military leader who embarked on 17 campaigns in 21 years. relentlessly expanding Egypt's empire into Syria, Palestine, and the northeast. His most renowned victory came in 1457 BC at the Battle of Megiddo, where Thutmose's forces decisively defeated a rebellious Canaanite coalition and captured the strategically important walled city after a grueling 7-month siege. The spoils of war were immense, including over 2,000 horses, nearly 1,000 chariots, hundreds of suits of bronze armor, and precious metals. Despite his seemingly invincible status, Thutmose's reign was not without its challenges. While his sprawling empire brought Egypt immense wealth and elevated him to the status of the most powerful man of his age, it also demanded that he spend a significant portion of his time on distant battlefields, far from the comforts of home. Ancient soldiering was a harsh existence. Soldiers marched for weeks under the scorching desert sun, wearing heavy bronze armor and wielding cumbersome weapons like spears, axes, and shields in chaotic hand-to-hand combat. Battle wounds from bronze blades were often severe and fatal, especially in unsanitary field conditions that could lead to septic infections. Even as the supreme ruler, Thutmose was not immune to the dangers faced by all ancient soldiers. Dehydration, heat stroke, festering injuries, and camp diseases were constant threats. He likely witnessed hundreds, if not thousands, of his men, including friends and family members, succumb to agonizing deaths far from the sacred black silt of the Nile River. One near-contemporary account from the annals of Thutmose III describes the great conqueror breaking down and weeping in anguish after a victory. He mourned for his fallen brothers who would never return to Egypt. After a 54-year reign filled with relentless campaigning, Thutmose III died not on the battlefield, but at home in Memphis at the ripe old age of 56. This remarkable longevity for an ancient Egyptian is evident in the discovery of his mummified body in 1881. The body revealed a warrior pharaoh plagued by painful dental abscesses, arterial sclerosis, and severe arthritis, possibly from old battle injuries. Even Thutmose, the magnificent ancient Egypt's greatest imperialist, was ultimately humbled by the physical costs extracted by a life of brutality and conquest. While the pharaohs and nobles enjoyed a relatively lavish lifestyle compared to the masses, even the highest in Egyptian society could not escape the harsh privations of their time. Disease, injury, infection, overwork, and malnutrition did not discriminate by class or rank. The weighty expectations and dangers faced by rulers like Thutmose III brought unique miseries and hardships all their own. From within their mud-brick hovels, the average Egyptian could perhaps be forgiven for looking up at the gold-bed pharaoh with not only reverence but also quiet envy. However, a closer examination reveals the heavy toll paid by kings and commoners alike. Life at both the top and bottom of ancient Egypt's hierarchy was often a world of adversity and affliction, hidden behind a glimmering facade of power and prosperity. Of course, the struggles of the pharaohs pale in comparison to the daily brutalities faced by those at the bottom rung of Egyptian society, peasants, servants, and slaves who toiled endlessly in backbreaking labor. While rulers like Thutmose III weathered the hardships of war and governance from positions of wealth and authority, the bulk of the population endured the ravages of nature and oppression without relief or recourse. For the masses forming the foundation of the Egyptian state and economy, life was dictated by the Nile River's capricious nature. In favorable years, when the annual floodwaters receded on schedule and deposited a thick layer of nutrient-rich black silt across the floodplain, Egyptian farmers could reap bountiful harvests of wheat, barley, figs, pomegranates, and other crops. This surplus supported nobles, scribes, artisans, priests, and the entire vast apparatus of the centralized state. However, when the mercurial Nile failed to deliver, the consequences were catastrophic. Insufficient water resulted in parched fields, withered crops, and barren harvests, leading to widespread famine. Conversely, excessive water and raging currents burst the earth and dikes, sending deadly floods cascading through villages, destroying homes and livelihoods, and spoiling the crops with a layer of stagnant water. In either scenario, it was the peasants who suffered the most and most severely. One such calamity is recorded during the reign of the 3rd dynasty pharaoh Hosea, who ruled from 2686 to 2649 BC. Ancient inscriptions narrate a terrible 7-year famine that ravaged Egypt when the Nile failed to flood adequately, leaving the fields barren. A text known as the Famine Stela provides a grim account of the catastrophe. All of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger to such an extent that people resorted to eating their children. The entire country resembled a starved grasshopper, with people traveling north and south in search of food. Those who built tombs, those who carried stones, all ceased their work. During this time when the Nile was empty, the pharaoh was compelled to open the royal granaries and import food from neighboring regions to prevent mass starvation and societal collapse. Nevertheless, many still perished from hunger and the accompanying diseases. The Palmo Stone, an ancient Egyptian annal, bluntly lists an uncountable number of deaths lost to the famine's grim embrace. Even during less dire times, the constant threat of scarcity and starvation loomed just one poor harvest away. Peasant families, comprising about 80% of the population, resided in cramped mud and reed dwellings, subsisting on a meager diet of bread, beer, onions, lentils, and dried fish. Sanitation was rudimentary at best, leading to rampant disease. Child mortality was alarmingly high, with perhaps half of all infants succumbing to malnutrition and infection before their first birthday. From childhood, most Egyptians endured a lifetime of dawn-to-dusk drudgery in the fields, construction sites, quarries, and mines. Agriculture was particularly grueling under the relentless desert sun, requiring manual planting and harvesting of wheat, barley, and flax, the use of crude wooden plows, and the arduous task of hauling buckets of water from the Nile for irrigation. All this labor was for the privilege of handing over a substantial portion as taxes in kind. During the inundation season, peasants who were not tending animals were often conscripted into forced labor gangs to work on ambitious public works projects commissioned by the pharaohs. Among these, the most renowned were the massive pyramids erected as eternal resting places for the rulers of the Old Kingdom. The first and largest of these was the Great Pyramid of Giza, constructed around 2550 BC for the 4th dynasty pharaoh Khufu. This towering monument, originally standing at 481 feet tall and covering 13 acres, was built from over 2 million colossal limestone blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus claimed that the Great Pyramid required the labor of 100,000 men working in 3-month shifts over a span of 20 years. While modern Egyptologists estimate the number of workers to be closer to 20,000 to 40,000, the sheer magnitude of this undertaking demands an almost unimaginable amount of human effort and suffering. The majority of the heavy lifting and hauling was accomplished using the simplest of tools. Ancient Egyptian laborers faced numerous hazards on the worksite. Ramps, sleds, rollers, levers, copper chisels, bronze saws, wooden rollers and sledges, ropes of papyrus and leather, and injuries from falling blocks, pulley failures, and scaffolding collapses were common. The grueling labor also led to crippling repetitive stress and musculoskeletal damage from decades of hard work. Fractures, crushed limbs, hernias, gashes from flint axes and adzes, infected wounds, blistered skin, and heat stroke were just some of the physical toll they endured. Archaeological excavations of workers' cemeteries near the Giza pyramids revealed the broken bodies of those who sacrificed their lives to build these eternal monuments. Skeletons showed numerous healed fractures, severe arthritis, spinal deformities, and missing limbs, grim proof of the physical toll exacted by punishing labor. While the life of an average peasant conscript was difficult, it was even more brutal for those at the bottom of Egypt's hierarchy, the slaves. Captured as prisoners of war during military campaigns or falling into debt bondage, slaves were subjected to the harshest and most dangerous work. They toiled in the mines, quarries, and fields with even less rest or rations than the peasants. One of the most notorious sites was the gold mine of Berm Fawahir in the eastern desert. This desolate, searingly hot landscape became a virtual death camp for the slaves and prisoners sent to mine gold for the pharaoh's coffers. An account from the 12th dynasty reign of Menemhat III, circa 1860 to 1814 BC, vividly describes the hellish conditions in which these individuals labored. Daily, they endured tenfold hardship, suffering from scorched skin, bleeding feet, failing breath, and broken bones. In summer, their faces were baked like earthen pots, their bones burned like summer flax, and their skin hung loose, ulcerated, and gashed from the stones. Starvation loomed large, accompanied by meager rations that left miners malnourished and vulnerable to diseases, particularly silicosis caused by inhaling rock dust in the tunnels. Frequent beatings from guards were meted out to those who faltered in their relentless toil. Many perished from injuries, illnesses, snake bites, and sheer exhaustion in this desolate valley of misery. Life expectancy for slaves in the pharaoh's eyes was often measured in mere months rather than years. While the dazzling gold artifacts displayed in the Cairo Museum reflect the wealth and splendor of ancient Egypt's god-kings, they also serve as a stark reminder of the incalculable human suffering that fueled such opulence. Behind each captivating death mask and gleaming sarcophagus lie the forgotten bones of faceless multitudes ground to dust in service of a civilization that exploited them as mere resources for the monarchy's machinations. Even those spared a life of servitude in the fields, mines, and work sites still faced daily dangers and hardships in the Nile River Valley. While the natural environment of ancient Egypt was bountiful, it was also fraught with lethal perils. The Nile, the life-giving river, was also a frequent harbinger of death, its apex predators, the Nile crocodile and the hippopotamus, posing a constant threat. Reaching up to 20 feet in length and weighing as much as a ton, the Nile crocodile was a fearsome ambush predator that haunted the imaginations of ancient Egyptians. With its armored hide, crushing jaws, and explosive speed, this cold-blooded killer took a steady toll on those who fished, washed, and drew water along the riverbanks. Children were particularly vulnerable, snatched suddenly and dragged to a thrashing, drowning death in the river's murky depths. The hippopotamus, while a herbivore, was equally dangerous due to its highly aggressive and unpredictable nature. Male hippopotamuses were fiercely territorial, while females would attack with little warning to defend their young. A bull hippo can weigh up to 3,000 pounds, run at 20 miles per hour, and crush a crocodile or a human like a grape with its massive jaws. Hippo attacks posed a constant threat to boers and fishermen along the Nile River. One harrowing account from the 12th dynasty, spanning from 1991 to 802 BC, recounts the terrifying encounter of a herdsman named Tabu. While tending his cattle near the river, Tabu was stalked and mauled by a lion. Despite surviving the ordeal, Tabu's petition to the local governor vividly describes the terror he endured. A lion pursued him relentlessly, its teeth bared and claws extended. 3 times, Tabu used his spear to fend off the lion, but it persisted. Eventually he fell, and the lion stood over him, its putrid breath on his face. Tabu realized his end was near, but for some reason, the gods spared him that day. This brush with death underscores the precariousness of life in a world teeming with powerful predators, where protection and medical care were scarce if attacked. Even the king of beasts posed a threat to those at the bottom of society's hierarchy. However, perhaps the most insidious and inescapable danger in ancient Egypt came not from large beasts, but rather from tiny creatures. The multitude of biting insects caused immense misery for humans and livestock alike. Mosquitoes emerging from the stagnant floodwaters of the Nile unleashed the scourges of malaria and yellow fever. Biting black flies spread blindness by clogging chokers. Filth flies swarmed decaying waste, spreading disenter and enteric disease. Lice and fleas infested hair, clothing, and bedding, tormenting their hosts with ceaseless itching and biting. But by far the deadliest insect was the humble desert locust. When conditions were favorable, these voracious grasshoppers congregated into ravenous swarms of biblical proportions. These swarms darkened the skies and descended upon fields, stripping them bare of all vegetation in a matter of hours. A single swarm could comprise billions of individuals, covering hundreds of square miles and consuming over 400 million pounds of crops daily. For ancient Egypt's farmers, who struggled to survive on the Nile's floodplain, a locust plague was a catastrophic event of existential significance. An ancient text known as the Admonitions of Ipuri, dating back to the first intermediate period between 2181 and 255 BC, vividly describes the devastation in apocalyptic terms. The text states all is ruin, The storehouses are bare, behold, we are plundered by the locusts. The fields are desolate, and the food is gone. The children wail, I am hungry, but there is nothing to give them. How long can we survive? Such locust plagues were disturbingly frequent in Egypt's long history, leading to famines that caused starvation, disease, civil unrest, and societal collapse. Even the pharaoh in his palace could not escape the repercussions as starving masses abandoned barren fields to gather in the cities, straining resources and threatening rebellion. Many scholars believe that a series of locust-driven famines and droughts ultimately toppled the Old Kingdom around 2200 BC, ushering in a dark age of chaos and fragmentation. While the natural world posed endless perils for ancient Egyptians, rich and poor alike, perhaps the greatest danger came not from without, but within. It stemmed from the cutthroat power politics among Egypt's ruling elites. In a rigid hierarchy where life and death were the prerogatives of the pharaoh and his inner circle, court intrigues and plots swirled like scorpions in a bottle. One of the most notorious examples comes from the end of the 17th dynasty around 1550 BC. The pharaoh, second, and Retau the Sioux, who ruled Upper Egypt from Thebes, was embroiled in a protracted struggle with the Hyksos kings who had occupied Lower Egypt and the Delta for the past century. Ancient accounts speak of a vicious feud between Secundra and the Hyksos ruler, Apep, over perceived slights and competing territorial claims. In the midst of this standoff, Second Enre appears to have been the victim of court treachery, possibly with the assistance of his rival Hyksos. His mummy, discovered in 1886, revealed a gruesome end for the pharaoh. His head was a virtual ruin of devastating wounds, with at least 5 heavy blows piercing his skull. These blows crushed his nose, shattered his cheekbones and jaw, and drove splinters of bone into his brain. The exact circumstances of his death remain a subject of debate, but Egyptologists believe he was likely murdered either in his sleep or during a palace coup. The hasty mummification, without any attempt to conceal the gruesome injuries or even remove the brain, suggests that his killers were in a hurry to dispose of the body and cover up the crime. His wife, Akotep II, seems to have managed to maintain order during the regency until their son, Amos I, was old enough. In ancient Egypt, some of the most severe punishments were reserved for tomb robbers. The abundance of valuables buried with the pharaohs and nobles proved too tempting for many in the lower classes. Jewelry, statuettes, furniture, and more could be stripped from tombs and sold on the black market for a substantial profit, making grave robbery a lucrative yet perilous endeavor. To deter this rampant crime and protect the sanctity of the tombs, authorities took great measures. Armed guards patrolled larger tombs and cemeteries, while the tombs themselves were filled with intricate mazes of passageways, dead ends, and booby traps designed to thwart intruders. Secret entrances were also concealed to hide burial chambers. The mummified bodies within were magically cursed by priests to rise up and torment anyone who disturbed their rest. Despite these precautions, tomb robbery persisted as a persistent scourge. When thieves were caught, the penalties were brutal and horrifying, with no room for half measures. A swift, painful death was only the beginning. To fully punish the perpetrators and deter any who might follow in their footsteps, Egyptian justice adopted a macabre symbolic approach. During the reign of Ramses IX in the 20th dynasty, around 1100 BC, tomb robbing had become an epidemic. The pharaoh's agents captured a band of thieves who had been plundering the tombs of nobles. Records from their interrogation revealed a grim picture of their fate. Under torture, the prisoners confessed to defiling numerous tombs throughout Egypt over several years. The great wealth they had stolen was long gone, leaving nothing to recover. For their unforgivable transgressions, the authorities condemned them to an elaborate and gruesome execution. First, the thieves' noses and ears were cut off while they were still alive. This was intended to deprive them of sensory pleasures in the afterlife. With anguished shrieks, the men were then impaled on sharpened stakes and left to writhe in agony as they died. But the punishment did not end there. In a final act of spite, the desecrated corpses were gathered and carried to a special embalmer. Despite the stench of blood and fear, the bodies were carefully mummified according to sacred rituals. Each thief's earthly remains, once preserved for eternity, were dishonorably entombed in a mass grave, their organs and possessions scattered. This ghastly display served as a dire warning to anyone who dared rob the dead. Not only would their lives be forfeited in the most painful manner, but their hopes for a joyful afterlife would also be obliterated. Denied all earthly rights and equipment, their souls would be lost between worlds, forever tormented. While this may seem excessively cruel, Egyptians widely regarded the tomb robbers' grim fate as fitting justice. The afterlife held supreme importance, and pyramid and tomb construction consumed untold resources. Stealing sacred grave goods damaged the spirits of the deceased and undermined faith in divine order. Only the harshest retribution could answer such a grave affront to society. While not every tomb robber faced such gruesome punishment, and in many cases corrupt authorities were involved in the thefts, the particularly vicious treatment of Ramses the Ninth Time stands as a stark reminder of the dangers that lurked in the pursuit of easy riches. Life may have been short and brutal for the average Egyptian, but death could be even more dreadful. Those who transgressed in life might find themselves facing eternal suffering instead of eternal reward. The severe penalties for tomb robbery were perhaps the ultimate expression of ancient Egypt's preoccupation with the afterlife. While the elite hoarded great wealth and power in gilded palaces, the threat of mutilation and damnation kept the lower classes in check. One might almost pity the thieves so brutally executed were it not for the sacred significance of their crimes. In a society so focused on death, perhaps no punishment could be too extreme. Ancient Egypt was a land marked by tombs, which loomed ominously across the desert as earthly portals to the spiritual realms. They beckoned to the desperate and daring with the allure of rich plunder and the peril of unimaginable suffering. Under the pharaoh's ruthless justice, stealing from the dead was to condemn one's own soul. The grim fates of Ramses IX's tomb robbers serve as a chilling warning in a realm where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural often blurred, and perhaps violating the sleep of the deceased was to invite horror beyond mortal comprehension. Whether taken as historical fact or apocryphal tale, the execution of the tomb thieves offers another haunting glimpse into the severity of ancient Egyptian life and death. For the average Egyptian, life revolved around constantly battling the ever-present specters of poverty, pain, and oblivion. Even in death, those who violated the sacred and social orders faced no escape or mercy. In this unforgiving world of backbreaking labor and swift retribution, perhaps the only thing worse than enduring life was confronting the eternal consequences of earthly misdeeds. While the magnificent monuments along the Nile still captivate us with visions of Egypt's golden age, it's crucial to remember the blood and bone that fueled those lofty ambitions. Behind each colossal stone lay 100 forgotten tragedies, and beneath each gleaming treasure lurked an abyss waiting to consume the unfortunate and the criminal. Although their practices were unspeakably cruel, perhaps the ghastly execution of tomb robbers was inevitable in a society so fixated on the worlds beyond. With cosmic order and immortal glory at stake, even petty crimes carried metaphysical weight. When your gods could devour your soul, what could be worse than the wrath of kings? Ultimately, life along the Nile was perhaps no different from anywhere else in the ancient world. The mighty few enjoyed power and luxury, while the anonymous multitudes toiled and suffered in the dust. The distinction lay in how the Egyptians codified this stark divide between throne and throng in their spiritual beliefs. If a peasant was worked to death or executed for theft, it was divine will manifest. The social order, like the annual floods that nourished the Black Land, had its ultimate source in the gods. To the pharaohs and priests, even the most heinous deeds were justified in upholding the eternal balance. There could be no mercy for those who threatened the cosmic symmetry in this life or the next. The thieves who dared to undermine the sacred compact between the living and the dead had to be utterly destroyed, their wretched souls scattered like chaff in the desert wind. For in ancient Egypt, the line between order and chaos was razor thin, and the price for transgression was beyond measure. So the next time you admire the grandeur of the pharaoh's creations, remember the countless legions of the forgotten who perished in their construction. Consider the fates of those who labored in the city of the dead and those who dared to steal from it. In the realm of the immortal kings, robbing a tomb was a direct path to oblivion. Despite the harsh realities of forced labor, ancient Egyptians managed to preserve their dignity and humanity in subtle ways. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of worker villages near the pyramids, where conscripted laborers and artisans resided during the arduous years of construction. Skeletal remains reveal that many suffered from arthritis, herniated discs, and other repetitive stress injuries. However, amidst the grueling toil, these workers carved out a semblance of existence for themselves and their families. Excavations have uncovered that the laborers lived in simple mud-brick apartments arranged in orderly rows. Each unit accommodated 4 to 8 workers, likely organized into teams. The village even boasted amenities such as communal dining halls, breweries for brewing beer, and kitchens for baking the abundant bread that constituted the foundation of their diet. This suggests that the workers were at least adequately fed and housed, rather than being treated as mere expendable slaves. Additionally, evidence of community and social bonds has been found. Potshers and limestone flakes served as rudimentary writing surfaces, and a few bare messages like "Friends Forever" or "May You Be Well and Healthy" have been discovered. Children's toys and carved game boards have also been unearthed, hinting at leisure time and the presence of families. Furthermore, the dead were buried with care, some even accompanied by small grave goods. All of these findings paint a picture of real people enduring together through challenging circumstances rather than faceless drones. The back-breaking labor in the merciless desert heat must have been truly grueling. Within their camps, the pyramid builders could savor a modest meal, sip some beer, and perhaps momentarily escape their burdens with a friendly game. These simple comforts likely made the difference between enduring misery and a harsh yet bearable existence. Of course, their labor was still forced, and no amount of bread and beer could alter the fundamental injustice of their servitude. These workers were not willing volunteers but captives and conscripts. While the term slave may be overly simplistic, they were certainly not free. Their relative privileges were ultimately granted at the whim of the pharaoh and his officials. The ancient Egyptians lacked the concept of freedom as we understand it. Even for those of higher status, their lives were always dedicated to serving the god-king and the state. The very notion of individual liberty was as foreign to their worldview as the verdant forests of distant lands. Hieroglyphs describe serving or following the pharaoh, but never mention personal freedom. This absence of even an idea of freedom may be difficult for us to comprehend. However, in a world where the pharaoh embodied divine rule, obedience was not merely a duty, but the very essence of one's existence. To toil and sweat in the service of the king was, in a sense, the highest calling, even if it was not a choice. From a modern perspective, constructing colossal pyramids to glorify god-kings may appear as a frivolous waste of human effort. The immense size and grandeur of these monuments required an almost unimaginable mobilization of labor and resources. For instance, the Great Pyramid of Giza is estimated to have taken approximately 20,000 workers over 20 years to complete, utilizing over 2 million limestone blocks, each weighing an average of over 2 tons. Consider the dozens of other pyramids that dot the Nile Valley, not to mention the countless temples, tombs, obelisks, and statues, and the scale of conscripted labor over the centuries becomes truly staggering. Generations dedicated their lives to the pharaoh's monumental visions, constructing an edifice complex unparalleled in human history. Despite the erosion of the once sharp angles over millennia, the sheer audacity and hubris of these projects endure. Even amidst immense cruelty and exploitation, there's an undeniable awe-inspiring quality to the pyramids rising eternally from the desert. They stand as testaments to human ingenuity, skill, and sheer tenacious willpower, even if misapplied. While the pharaohs were tyrants, the workers who realized their fevered dreams were not mindless drones. In their own way, they achieved a form of immortality through their creations. Admittedly, this offers little comfort to those who suffered and died to achieve that immortality. If given the choice, most would likely have preferred simple agrarian lives, tending to their crops and cattle. Instead, circumstance drafted them into lifelong servitude, hauling multi-ton blocks up an artificial mountain in the scorching heat. Their reward was not riches or fame, but perhaps a slightly larger ration of bread, a jug of beer, and a simple mud-brick tomb. Yet even within these harsh constraints, they strove to find meaning and humanity in their days, however meager. Ultimately, their legacy lies not just in the soaring monuments they left behind, but in the humble traces of their everyday struggles and fleeting joys, a crude message of friendship. These are the artifacts of real human lives, glimmers of light in the shadow of the pyramids. As we gaze up at the towering achievements of the pharaohs and marvel at the ancient Egyptians' architectural prowess, let us also remember the many hands that made it all possible at such a heavy cost. The true wonders of Egypt are not just the grand tombs of kings, but the quiet resilience of the laborers who endured lives of grinding hardship to build them. In their own unique way, they too have endured through the ages, patiently waiting for us to uncover and remember their stories. Despite its beauty and mystery, ancient Egypt was a civilization deeply rooted in exploitation from its very inception. The unimaginable splendor of the pharaohs' courts and the golden glories of their tombs were paid for with the sweat and blood of tens of thousands. This is the stark contrast to the dazzling facade. The cost was measured in endless years of toil under the harsh whips of overseers. Yet it is a testament to the indomitable human spirit that even in the face of such oppression, people found small ways to persevere and endure. In the cool shadows of mud-brick huts, conscripted pyramid builders found solace in friendship, community, and the modest comforts of food and leisure. They may have been bound in service to the god-kings, but they stubbornly carved out spaces for their own humanity. These everyday Egyptians, whose names are lost to history, even as the kings they served live on in eternal fame, are the true ancestors of the land. Dynasties rose and fell, and the kingdoms of pharaohs flourished and faded. However, the common people endured through the millennia, passing down their quiet resilience from generation to generation. In their stories of suffering and survival, we may find a more relatable and enduring legacy than in all the gold of the royal tombs. The ancient Egyptians believed that speaking the name of the dead would bring them back to life. Perhaps then, simply learning about the lives of the pyramid builders and conscripted laborers is a form of remembrance, a way to honor their struggles and their humanity across the vast expanse of time. They may not have been kings or gods, but they too have earned a place in eternity. Word count 1231. The mummified body of the thief lay on display, serving as a grim warning to anyone who dared to rob the sacred tombs of the pharaohs. Grave robbing was rampant during the reign of Ramses I in the 12th century BC. Times were dire, and many resorted to plundering the riches buried with ancient kings. However, the cost of feeding one's family with grave goods was a horrific death. Condemned individuals were subjected to brutal torture, their arms twisted until they snapped, backs lashed into bloody shreds, and embers pressed into their bare flesh. Anything was done to extract their confessions. In the end, they all did. Swift and terrible retribution followed. The fortunate ones were beheaded, their severed heads mounted on pikes. Others endured slower, cruel fates, such as flaying alive, impaling through the gut, or being entombed in sarcophagi filled with ravenous flesh-eating beetles. Their bodies were then mummified and callously stuffed into the very tombs they had tried to rob. These ghastly punishments, though barbaric by today's standards, held significant meaning in Egyptian culture. The pharaohs believed in eternal life after death, expecting to enjoy forever the treasures buried with them. Stealing these grave goods not only deprived the kings of their wealth, but also threatened their immortality. Such a sin against the gods could not go unanswered. Therefore, the mummies of the tomb robbers stood forever in the tunnels, violating an eternal sentence. Their disfigured remains served as a grim reminder of the perils of desecrating the dead. Authorities ensured that all the gruesome details spread throughout the kingdom, deterring other would-be thieves. While life may have been desperate for the peasants of ancient Egypt, so poor that they risked even the pharaoh's curse, in death, the kings always emerged victorious. The more of their subjects they could pack into their plundered tombs, the better. As if the threat of torturous execution wasn't enough, ancient Egyptians faced numerous other mortal perils in their daily lives. The very wildlife of the Nile River Valley, their home, allied with deadly animals. The Nile's banks were teeming with Nile crocodiles, enormous armored reptiles capable of dragging fishermen to their doom in a mere flash of thrashing teeth. Portly hippos may appear docile, but they are fiercely territorial and capable of inflicting severe injuries with their formidable tusks. Growling lions roamed the desert dunes, occasionally preying on shepherds or wanderers. Poisonous serpents like cobras and vipers lurked in the underbrush or coiled beneath woodpiles, striking with lethal venom. Desert scorpions, equipped with dagger-like stingers, delivered agonizingly toxic blows. No Egyptian was ever far from encountering a deadly threat. From the lowest mud-splattered peasant to the highest royal, even Pharaoh Menes, the legendary unifier of Egypt, is said to have met his demise in the jaws of a rogue hippo along the riverbank. Nature's fury spared no one. Humans weren't the only ones who suffered from the Nile's deadly fauna. These beasts also engaged in deadly encounters with each other. A tomb painting from around 1900 BC depicts the harrowing tale of a humble herdsman named Tabu and his encounter with a lion. One evening, as Tabu drove his cattle along their grazing grounds, he was startled by a terrifying roar. Turning around, he faced a mighty male lion, its toy mane bristling and yellow eyes glaring. Overwhelmed with fear, Tabu realized he was no match for this ultimate predator. The lion crept closer, its muscular shoulders rippling beneath its hide. It let out a chilling growl that paralyzed Tabu's legs. He could only watch helplessly as the great cat sprang at his herd, crushing a young calf's neck with a single slash of its terrible claws. As the rest of the cattle bellowed and stampeded in panic, Tabu seized his opportunity. He turned on his heel and fled, abandoning his livelihood but desperate to save his own life. The dying bleats of the calf echoed behind him as he ran. Tabu managed to reach safety and lived to recount the tale depicted on the tomb wall. However, his ordeal was a common occurrence. Peasant farmers and herdsmen faced a constant struggle to protect their animals from predators like lions, crocodiles, and hippos. This struggle could determine whether they had enough food to eat or went hungry. However, perhaps no pests caused more havoc in ancient Egypt than insects, despite their smaller size. While the scarab beetle was revered as a sacred symbol of rebirth, most Egyptian insects evoked revulsion and fear. Locusts were the most dreaded of all. These voracious grasshoppers would descend upon the land unexpectedly, covering the skies like a writhing curtain for miles. They devoured every plant in their path, stripping fields bare of wheat, barley, and vegetables in mere hours. A severe locust infestation could completely decimate harvests, leaving no food to fill the kingdom's granaries. Famines would follow in their wake, as surely as the gnawed stubble of ravaged crops. All the farmers could do was pray, burn offerings, and wait for the relentless swarms to pass. Other creeping and buzzing vermin made daily life a misery for the Egyptians. Flies swarmed around them in thick, droning clouds, and mosquitoes wailed incessantly in their ears at night. Ants invaded their mud-brick homes, and roaches skittered underfoot. Lice and biting fleas tormented their skin, while intestinal worms robbed their bodies of essential nutrients. These parasitic pests not only caused constant discomfort, but also spread disease. With poor sanitation and close quarters, outbreaks of malaria, dysentery, and typhoid fever ravaged the populace. The Egyptians had no understanding of the role insects played in spreading these illnesses. They could only blame the gods or evil spirits. Between the untamable wilds of nature and the squalid conditions of their man-made society, sickness and death shadowed the Egyptians at every step. Even the luckiest and wealthiest could never fully escape their spectre. Perhaps the most vulnerable group in ancient Egypt were the very youngest children. In the unforgiving environment, children were the most susceptible to death. It's estimated that as many as 1 in 3 infants died before their first birthday, and only about half of all children lived to see the age of 5. The child mortality rate was staggering, with malnutrition and disease claiming countless young lives. Starvation was a constant threat for the poorest families, and even the more prosperous struggled to provide for their children during lean times and famines. Contaminated food and water spread diseases like dysentery, cholera, and other deadly intestinal infections. Childhood injuries and accidents were often fatal, with young ones falling into the Nile's waters, being snatched by crocodiles, trampled by oxen, or crushed under toppling mud-brick walls. Snake bites, scorpion stings, and infected wounds frequently proved too much for their small bodies to overcome. But even more insidious were the ailments that could not be seen, invisible microbial killers that struck without warning. Newborns shuddered with tetanus contracted through the cut of an unclean blade, while theria ravaged tiny throats and choked the breath from fragile lungs. Scarlet fever scorched across delicate skin and seared vulnerable brains without vaccines or antibiotics. No amount of a mother's desperate prayers or a healer's herbs could reverse these grim diagnoses. Parents were left clutching, cooling lifeless forms to their chests, keening their grief to an indifferent sky. Childhood death was so ubiquitous that the Egyptians almost seemed to expect it. Many didn't name their babies for months after birth, perhaps to spare themselves even greater heartache when the near inevitable loss occurred. Children weren't considered full members of society until around the age of 5 or 6, when their odds of survival finally improved. For those youths who survived, there was little time to celebrate. As soon as they were able, most children were put to work alongside their elders. Farmers' sons followed their fathers into the fields, while daughters helped their mothers grind grain, carry water, and tend to younger siblings. In artisans' workshops, nimble young fingers wove flax into linen and shaped clay on the potter's wheel. Among the poorest families, children as young as 5 could be sold into servitude to pay off their parents' debts. They might labor as unskilled workers on the pharaoh's building projects, hauling bricks and buckets of sand larger than they were. Alternatively, they would be sent to toil in a noble's home, sleeping on the kitchen floor and scrubbing, fetching, and serving from dawn to dusk. This backbreaking labor took a severe toll on growing bodies, already weakened by malnourishment and illness. Many children bore evidence of severe anemia, stunted growth, spinal deformities, and degenerative joint diseases. Others lost fingers, toes, or limbs to infected wounds and fractures that never healed properly. However, perhaps the most poignant archaeological finds are those that attest to the love behind the loss. In the ruins of the workers' cemetery at Deir el-Medina, a child-sized mummy was discovered, still clutching a beloved toy carved in the shape of a cat. A baby was buried with a rattle fashioned from a turtle shell, ensuring they would never feel alone. Heartbreakingly small skeletons were unearthed, still unfolded in their weeping parents' arms, interred together for all eternity. Delicately painted wooden coffins held the fragile remains of infants, commissioned despite the crushing poverty of their bereaved families. These whispering remnants remind us that, regardless of how long ago they lived, these were parents who adored their children. Each of these burials represents a life cut short and a grief that is too heavy to ever fully leave behind. The ancient Egyptians, facing staggering childhood mortality, may have had no choice but to persevere. However, the pain of a parent who had to lay their precious child to rest was timeless and unending. Tragically, once an Egyptian survived childhood, the dangers of growing up persisted. As children matured into puberty, the grim threat of death in childbirth loomed over half the population. In ancient Egypt, as in most societies throughout history, a woman's primary role was to marry and bear children to perpetuate the family line. Girls were considered fertile property first and foremost, with their individual hopes and desires secondary to marital obligations. Daughters were under the strict authority of their fathers, brothers, or nearest male relative. Upon reaching the age of 12 or 13, a girl would be married off to her father's chosen husband. Often significantly older, the groom's selection was based on social status, economic or political benefits rather than love. A new wife's primary duty was to bear her husband as many children as possible, especially sons. However, in an era devoid of modern medicine, this biological imperative came at a devastating cost. Complications of pregnancy and childbirth were the leading cause of death for women in their reproductive years. Without reliable contraception, an Egyptian woman could expect to become pregnant 5 to 8 times over her lifetime. Each pregnancy was grueling, exacerbated by poor nutrition, inadequate prenatal care, and physical hardships. Expectant mothers continued to perform arduous domestic labor and carry heavy loads until their babies arrived. Childbirths themselves were excruciating and perilous, fraught with the possibility of life-threatening complications that women were ill-equipped to endure. Laboring mothers endured excruciating pain and pushed for hours or even days, relying solely on rudimentary assistance and comfort. Trusted female relatives and midwives were present to offer support, but their resources were limited to traditional folk wisdom, herbal remedies, and prayers to the goddess Tower. Unfortunately, these measures were often insufficient to prevent complications. Babies frequently became stuck in the birth canal, slowly suffocating as their exhausted mothers bled profusely around them. Fetuses that couldn't pass through narrow hips were dismembered using primitive instruments. Infections raged and claimed the lives of feverish women. Women's perineums were torn apart beyond repair, leaving them with lifelong agony and incontinence if they didn't bleed out first. Even if a new mother managed to successfully deliver a healthy baby, her risks were far from over. The postpartum period was fraught with dangers, including retained placentas that caused septic shock, breastfeeding difficulties, and mastitis that drained women of their strength, and fatal blood clots that lodged in weakened lungs and stopped tired hearts. Some women endured the trauma of multiple stillbirths, miscarriages, and neonatal deaths before succumbing to their injuries. Others survived only to be rendered sterile by scarring and were discarded by husbands who valued them solely for their fertility. It's important to recognize that these cruel fates were not limited to peasant women. The mummified remains of queens and princesses reveal similar stories. Damage to their pelvic bones and evidence of severe birthing injuries have been found in the corpses of some of Egypt's most prominent ladies. Even royal blood could not protect them from the inescapable dangers of their sex. As in childhood, the specter of sudden death loomed at every stage of an ancient Egyptian woman's life. From the tender age of puberty to the birthing bed, the grim cycles of fertility bound their bodies to an existence that was often cut short. There was no escaping the perils of simply being female. The best an ordinary woman could hope for was to bear living children, securing her place in the family, and then to toil in servitude and ill health into old age. The worst fate was an agonizing descent into darkness, drowning in her own blood amidst the stench of lurid infection and the cries of the motherless infant she left behind. Even women who managed to escape the ravages of childbirth faced oppression and restriction at every turn. In ancient Egypt's rigidly patriarchal society, a woman's worth was entirely dependent on her relationship with the men who controlled her. Daughters were always under the authority of their fathers or nearest male relative, and at no point in her life was she considered an autonomous being. She couldn't own or inherit property or land except under extraordinary circumstances. Essentially, a woman was the property of her father, then her husband, to be disposed of as he saw fit. A respectable woman's role was to serve as a virtuous wife and mother, overseeing her household and ensuring her husband's comfort and pleasure. From dawn to dusk, her primary purposes were grinding grain, baking bread, brewing beer, spinning linen, tending children, and satisfying her husband's sexual urges. Her most prized attributes were modesty, obedience, and fertility. An intractable or barren wife could be cast out of the family, left to starve, or forced into beggary and prostitution. A husband was well within his rights to beat or mutilate a disobedient wife for even trivial offenses, and no one would come to her aid. While marriage was theoretically a partnership of complementary equals in practice, the husband held all the power and made all the decisions. Women had little to no autonomy even within their marriages. A subservient wife was expected to be quiet, pliant, and submissive, never challenging her husband's actions or opinions. Anything less could invite brutal punishment. Under this system of institutionalized subjugation, women were denied true freedom to pursue their desires and needs. Any hint of independence or defiance could result in severe consequences, including loss of livelihood, reputation, and even life. Simply because of their gender, they faced constant threats and dangers. However, there were some notable exceptions to these rigid gender roles. A small number of elite women rose to great power and prestige, often through their connections to the pharaoh. Royal wives, mothers, and daughters wielded significant influence over the king and the court. Some even ruled as female pharaohs, while others served pivotal roles as gods' wives of Amun, officiating the holiest religious rituals. These women were extraordinary exceptions, not the norm. The vast majority of Egyptian women, from the poorest peasants to the low nobility, had no such avenues to authority. Their prescribed path in life was to serve men, bear children, and work until they were old and frail. Any deviation from this path was met with swift and harsh punishment. Even one of ancient Egypt's most famously powerful women, Queen Nefertiti, was ultimately subservient to the men in her life. Queen Nefertiti, the great royal wife of the rebel pharaoh Akhenaten, is renowned for her stunning beauty and the unprecedented status she held during her husband's reign. Reliefs and statuary depict Nefertiti in poses previously reserved only for a pharaoh, such as crushing Egypt's enemies beneath her feet. She is shown officiating in religious ceremonies alongside Akhenaten, not as a meek consort, but as a partner, a revolutionary concept. Some evidence even suggests that she may have ruled in her own right after his death. Despite her privileged position, Tabu's frightening encounter with the lion serves as a reminder of the ever-present dangers that wildlife posed to the ancient Egyptians even in their daily lives. Lions, crocodiles, hippopotamuses, cobras, and scorpions posed a constant threat, especially for those who worked outdoors in fields or along the Nile. A moment's inattention or a stroke of misfortune could lead to tragedy. However, it wasn't just large, ferocious beasts that made life miserable for the Egyptians. Smaller creatures like insects and rodents also caused significant harm. Locust swarms, though occasional, were devastating, capable of stripping fields bare of crops in hours. A major infestation could wipe out food supplies, causing widespread famine and starvation. Even in normal times, pests like mice, fleas, flies, and grain weevils made Egyptian homes unpleasant. These vermin spread filth, spoiled food stores, and carried diseases, causing distress to families. It was an unending battle to keep them at bay in cramped living quarters. Given the numerous dangers and discomforts of the natural world, it's no wonder the ancient Egyptians placed such a strong emphasis on controlling and appeasing the forces of nature through magic, ritual, and religion. They recognized their vulnerability in the face of untamable wildlife. However, there was another danger to Egyptian children and families that was even more heartbreaking: the grim specter of childhood mortality. For most Egyptians, death was a frequent visitor to their homes, snatching away infants and youngsters with devastating regularity. The child mortality rate in ancient Egypt was appallingly high by modern standards. It's estimated that around 1/3 of Egyptian children died before the age of 5, with even more perishing before reaching adulthood. The causes were numerous complications during childbirth: malnutrition, infections, accidents, and injuries. With limited medical knowledge, Egyptians were often helpless to save their ailing little ones. For parents, the grief of losing a child was compounded by the economic hardships it brought. Children were integral to the family labor force, contributing to the fields, pastures, and workshops from a young age. Their contributions were crucial in sustaining the household. The loss of these valuable workers made the family's struggle for survival even more challenging. This high mortality rate had a profound impact on Egyptian family life. Couples often had many children, not only to ensure some would survive, but also to provide security for their parents' old age. Large families with numerous siblings were the norm, even though it strained resources. The more children a family had, the better their chances of having descendants to care for them in their twilight years. Egyptian parents lived with the knowledge that some of their beloved children would likely be taken from them too soon. It was a painful reality that even the pharaohs in their palaces weren't immune to. For instance, the renowned boy King Tutankhamun was preceded by 2 stillborn daughters, tiny mummies that were buried with him to be cradled in the afterlife. The shadow of childhood death loomed so large that it was deeply ingrained in Egyptian religion and culture. Children were buried with great care and ritual, often accompanied by grave goods such as toys, amulets, and food to comfort them in the afterlife. The goddess Isis was revered as the protector of children, alongside deities like Bes and Tauret. Magical spells and medical treatises offered remedies and protections for young ones. However, the unfortunate truth was that no amulet, spell, or offering could shield every danger that an Egyptian child might encounter. For bereaved parents, the only real solace was the belief that their lost little ones would find peace and ease in the beautiful field of reeds, where life was simple and suffering was unknown. The trauma and sorrow of losing a child transcend cultural and historical boundaries, making it one of the most devastating experiences a parent can endure. But for the ancient Egyptians, it was an inescapable part of family life, alongside all the other hardships they faced. Perhaps this constant reminder of mortality made them so determined to savor life's joys and pleasures, indulging in music, dancing, feasting, and games. They understood all too well how fleeting and fragile life could be, so they cherished their living children fiercely, showering them with affection and preparing them for the duties and trials ahead. However, despite their best efforts, Egyptian parents couldn't shield their children from every danger. One of the greatest threats to a child's health and safety often came from the very people who were supposed to protect them: Egypt's primitive doctors and surgeons. To our modern eyes, the medical practices of ancient Egypt appeared downright gruesome. While Egyptian medicine was actually quite advanced for its time, incorporating observation, diagnosis, and treatment, it was still crude and unsanitary. Much of an Egyptian doctor's repertoire would be considered barbaric by today's standards. Medicines were made from all sorts of nauseating ingredients, including rotten meat, animal dung, fly specks, and dirt. Cuts and wounds were dressed with raw meat piccases crawling with bacteria. Headaches and seizures were treated by drilling holes in the patient's skull. Ailments and illnesses were blamed on evil spirits or the malign influences of deities. Surgery, too, was a grim affair. While Egyptian surgeons were skilled enough to set broken bones, repair wounds, and even perform brain surgery, their operations were medieval in nature. There was no anesthesia beyond a swig of alcohol or a knock to the head. No antiseptics or sterile tools, just knives, hooks, and saws that were wiped clean and reused. It's a wonder that anyone survived these procedures at all. We can perhaps forgive the Egyptian physicians for their shortcomings. After all, they were working without the benefit of modern medical knowledge. They couldn't see the germs that caused infections, understand the circulatory system, or diagnose internal ailments using X-rays and scans. In a world where even a minor scrape could lead to a fatal infection, their brutal treatments likely saved some lives. However, an ancient Egyptian sickbed was the last place you'd want to be. Your suffering would likely be prolonged with ineffective and excruciating treatments. And if you were fortunate enough to be selected for surgery, you had to pray that your constitution was strong enough to withstand the shock and blood loss, and that Semet would save you from succumbing to your doctor's cures. We can glimpse this frightening medical landscape in the famous Edwin Smith Papyrus. This ancient Egyptian text, dating back to 1600 BC, is the oldest known surgical treatise in the world. It's a remarkably detailed document describing 48 different medical cases and their treatments, ranging from head wounds to spinal injuries. One particularly graphic case details a patient with a compound fracture of the skull. The unfortunate patient's brain is exposed, pulsing through the shattered bone. The attending surgeon calmly assesses the wound, probing it with his fingers, noting the bleeding and the sunken fragments of skull beneath the scalp. His recommended treatment involves applying piccases of honey, oil, and lint to cover the gaping wound, prayers and spells to the healing deities, and a grim warning that this is an ailment not to be treated. In essence, the patient is likely doomed. This chilling snapshot provides a stark reality of Egyptian medicine: no comforting bedside manner, no pain relief, no real hope for recovery from a catastrophic injury. Instead, there was pragmatic, almost detached analysis, and an unspoken acceptance that the human body's fragilities and mysteries were beyond the physician's powers. For most patients, the best-case scenario was likely a prolonged and unpleasant recovery, accompanied by the risk of complications and secondary infections. The worst-case scenario was an agonizing and drawn-out death, often caused by the very treatments meant to save them. This stark contrast highlights the stark difference between ancient Egyptian medicine and the gleaming hospitals and advanced surgeries of today. Despite its brutality, Egyptian medicine remained a vital and respected part of their society. Doctors were highly regarded professionals, sometimes even attaining semi-divine status. Their skills and knowledge were considered divine gifts, weapons in the eternal struggle against suffering and death. In a world fraught with perils, from wild beasts and raging battles to the ravages of time, these skills were always in demand. The ancient Egyptians placed their trust in their doctors and prayed for guidance from Heka, Sekhmet, and Isis. They had little choice. The grim litany of dangers and hardships we've explored from the harsh environment to oppressive rulers to unseen parasites and diseases, paints a harrowing picture of life in ancient Egypt. Suffering and struggle were woven into the very fabric of existence for most people. Despite these many trials, the Egyptians managed to build one of the most enduring and spectacular civilizations in human history. Their monuments still stand tall over the desert sands, their golden masks and sarcophagi glimmer in museum shrines, and their gods and myths continue to captivate our imaginations. How did they achieve such heights in the face of such adversity? Their sheer tenacity, ingenuity, and grit. First and foremost, the ancient Egyptians were masters of persevering through hardships, finding ways to adapt and innovate, and harnessing the power of human cooperation on a massive scale. But more importantly, they were driven by a powerful set of shared beliefs. The ancient Egyptians believed that the gods could be appeased and the forces of nature controlled through worship and ritual. They held a faith that earthly power mirrored heavenly order, and their pharaohs had a divine mandate to rule. They were certain that life's difficulties and impermanence were merely phases in an eternal journey, and that the virtuous would find their reward in the paradise of the afterlife. These beliefs provided the Egyptians with a sense of purpose, structure, and continuity, enabling them to endure historical upheavals. Even the humble peasant toiling in the fields saw his mundane labors as part of a cosmic cycle of death and regeneration. The soldier marching off to battle trusted that the gods would fight alongside him, and his sacrifice would be celebrated forever. The grieving parent, laying a child to rest in the tomb, knew it wasn't a final farewell, but a temporary parting before a joyful reunion in the field of reeds. In many ways, Egypt's spiritual world mirrored the material one, but it was perfected, sanctified, stripped of pain and want. It was an idealized plane of existence where the Nile never ran dry, the harvests never failed, bodies were made whole and incorruptible, justice always prevailed, and all souls found peace. Glimpsing this shining vision of eternity gave the Egyptians the strength to endure the worst of times. Perhaps that is the greatest wonder of the ancient Egyptians, not their temples or their tombs, but their extraordinary resilience in the face of adversity. Their ability to confront the darkest aspects of the human experience, the suffering, cruelty, and loss that are inescapable in any age, and still maintain an unwavering faith in beauty, order, meaning, and the ultimate triumph of the eternal over the temporal, is a staggering existential achievement that resonates with us still across the vast gulf of time. We may possess antibiotics, air conditioning, and the rule of law, yet we continue to grapple with the fundamental vulnerability of the human condition. We persistently seek to impose a sense of meaning and permanence on the chaos of the world. In our own modern way, we are not so different from the ancient Egyptians, constructing their pyramids of glass and steel, crafting their identities for the digital afterlife, and reaching for transcendence through art, ritual, and shared myth. We are all engaged in the same battle they faced, striving to endure and matter in the face of life's fleeting and brutal nature. Therefore, perhaps the most profound lesson we can derive from the hardships of ancient Egypt is one of humility, empathy, and awe. It is a recognition of the challenges they faced and the remarkable achievements they accomplished despite them all. It is a respect for the grit and grace of the men, women, and children who lived and struggled along the Nile so long ago, finding beauty amidst their trials. Above all, it is a profound sense of our shared human journey, our common quest to create something enduringly meaningful from our finite and fragile lives, as the ancient Egyptians did with such tenacity and splendor. This struggle is an age-old and global endeavor, and there is wisdom and solace in remembering that we are not alone in this path. As the sun sinks behind the cliffs, casting long shadows over the Valley of the Kings, the vast Theban necropolis is bathed in shades of gold and fire. The heat of the day gives way to the cool embrace of the evening. In the twilight, the ancient past feels tangible, almost within reach. You can almost hear the chanting of the priests, the whisper of linen robes, and the rattle of ceremonial jewelry as a mummified pharaoh is carried to his final resting place. For a fleeting moment, the veil between the worlds becomes thin, allowing us to glimpse the divine. However, as the first stars begin to glimmer in the deepening blue, the spell is broken, and the tombs and temples recede into shadow, their secrets sealed away for another night. The voices of the past fade into silence, Yet their stories endure. Triumphs and tragedies, soaring monuments and forgotten graves, prayers, protests, and the ever-flowing river, they linger in the land, in artifacts, and even in the very dust. These stories serve as an eternal testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Although we may walk different paths under different skies, the ancient Egyptians remain with us, just as all those who came before us. Their hopes, heartbreaks, wisdom, and warnings echo in our own journeys. Let us remember them as we drift towards dreams in the dark, carrying their stories with us and adding our own verses to the timeless tale. Let us face our struggles and sorrows with the same courage and unwavering faith, for we are all part of the same ancient current, all heirs to the same human inheritance. The Nile continues to flow from the heart of Africa to the sea, and the sun's cycle remains unchanged, turning from the eastern horizon to the west. As long as the story continues, as long as there are those who remember, dream, and build, a part of ancient Egypt will live on. Not in the cold permanence of stone, but in the warm breath of the telling. Good night, and may your journey through the field of reeds be filled with joy and light. Life in ancient Egypt was often harsh, brutish, and short for most of its inhabitants. While the towering pyramids, glittering golden treasures, and regal pharaohs in their magnificent headdresses captivate our imaginations, these are carefully curated snapshots that don't reflect the harsh realities faced by most Egyptians, regardless of their social status. Beneath the polished veneer of wealth and artistry lay a civilization built on backbreaking labor, rigid hierarchy, and the unforgiving whims of the natural world. One of the greatest challenges ancient Egyptians faced daily was the oppressive social hierarchy that dictated every aspect of their lives. At the top of the pyramid stood the pharaoh, revered as a living god whose word was absolute law. Below him were a select group of nobles, priests, and scribes who held power and privilege. However, the vast majority of Egyptians, including farmers, laborers, and slaves, lived at the bottom with little hope of upward mobility. Their lives were an endless cycle of plowing, planting, harvesting, and paying heavy taxes in grain to the state and temples. Most barely managed to survive, living hand-to-mouth in crumbling mud-brick hovels. During the annual flooding of the Nile, they were conscripted to work on the pharaoh's grand building projects in the scorching heat of the sun. Some of the fortunate ones hauled limestone blocks up ramps to construct the pyramids, while others dug canals, repaired dikes, or dragged barges laden with obelisks and colossal statues hundreds of miles. The work was exhausting, dangerous, and required only the most primitive tools and brute strength. We can only imagine the suffering endured by the estimated 100,000 laborers who built the Great Pyramid of Giza over 2 decades during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu around 2550 BC. Barefoot and barebacked, they worked in punishing conditions, chiseling and hauling 2.5-ton blocks up a sweltering stone ramp to a height of over 450 feet. Injuries, sunstroke, and death were common occurrences. Barracks and cemeteries around the pyramid reveal that workers often died before the age of 30 due to the extreme physical strain, bone fractures, and lung disease caused by inhaling stone dust. Despite this, Khufu himself lived in supreme luxury, sailing his royal yacht, Horizon of the Two Lands, along the Nile, hunting lions in the desert, and being fanned by servants under the cedar roof of his palace. The stark contrast between those who commanded the labor and those who gave their lives to it was undeniable. At least the pyramid builders were technically free subjects, not slaves. However, one wonders if there was much difference considering their lack of control over their lives and destinies. True slavery was widely practiced in ancient Egypt. Captives seized in military campaigns were forced into a lifetime of labor in galleys, quarries, mines, and fields. Moreover, any Egyptian could be enslaved for falling into debt, which was common during times of famine or when the Nile failed to flood adequately, resulting in poor harvests. Records from Pharaoh Neferu's reign around 2600 BC reveal severe hardships when the annual inundation was insufficient for several consecutive years. With crops withering in the fields, many farmers became destitute and sold themselves into bondage to creditors and to labor on the pharaoh's building projects. Neferu commissioned the first true pyramid, The Red Pyramid at Dashur. Thousands of slaves labored to build his monument in the scorching desert heat, many succumbing to exhaustion and deprivation. To add insult to injury, Pharaoh Senferu decreed that slaves could be executed for the crimes of their masters and have their skins stretched over his drums. Such was the complete dehumanization and expendability of a person who had the misfortune of becoming enslaved. Even the pharaoh himself was not immune to the harsh realities of ancient Egyptian life, particularly given the relentless wars and military campaigns waged to expand and defend the empire's borders. While pharaohs were revered as invincible god-kings, many met their ends violently on the battlefield or witnessed their reigns marred by turmoil and bloodshed. A life of conquest and military glory was considered the highest virtue for a pharaoh, but it came at a steep cost. Perhaps no pharaoh epitomized the relentless military zeal more than Thutmose III, who led 17 campaigns into Canaan and Syria over 2 decades in the 15th century BC. At the Battle of Megiddo, Thutmose III crushed a coalition of rebellious Canaanite chieftains after a daring march through a narrow mountain pass. He slaughtered hundreds, displayed their bodies before the city walls, and took their hands and penises as gruesome war trophies. As the annals boast, His Majesty returned to his father, Amun, in joy of heart. He came bearing the plunder, Asiatic captives, chiefs' children, and their horses. The total number of living prisoners was 340, and 83 hands were taken as trophies. Years of desert warfare undoubtedly took a toll on Thutmose III's physical and mental well-being. The scorching heat, strenuous exertion, and relentless stress weathered his features, leaving new scars and lines on his flesh. Moreover, the thousands of young Egyptian men who marched off to fight alongside him, never to return, or who returned maimed, burned, and broken in body and spirit, weighed heavily on his conscience. How many wives became widows? How many children were left fatherless? And how many parents mourned sons lost to the pharaoh's glory? The price of empire was paid in blood. Even in times of peace and prosperity, average Egyptians had little respite from the hardships of their daily lives. The unforgiving climate and environment along the Nile were a constant source of misery that transcended social classes. From nobleman to fisherman, the merciless Egyptian sun beat down on all, scorching exposed skin and stinging the eyes with its glare. Shade was scarce in villages and fields, and sunstroke claimed many lives who labored excessively without relief from the heat. Dehydration posed an ever-present threat, capable of killing a man as surely as any weapon. The annual Nile flood, crucial for irrigating the fields with rich black silt, also brought destruction and danger. A flood that was too high could wash away entire villages, drown livestock, and leave thousands destitute. Conversely, a flood that was too low withered the crops, leading to famine, as it did during the reign of Pharaoh Joseph around 2670 BC. Jose, the architect behind the first step pyramid at Saqqara, faced a dire crisis when the Nile failed to rise for several years, leaving the fields parched and cracked. The people wailed in the streets, their bellies swelling with hunger, and the air was rife with the stench of rotting cattle carcasses. Jose had no choice but to open the state granaries and import food from abroad to prevent the collapse of society. However, even when the Nile behaved, it posed numerous dangers. Crocodiles basked menacingly on the banks, ready to drag the careless into the watery abyss. Hippos capsized fishing boats and mauled villagers who strayed too close. And the river harbored the dreaded schistosomiasis worm, which caused an agonizing bloody urinary disease. Daily life was fraught with perils at every turn. For most ancient Egyptians, home offered little respite from the harsh environment. The typical mud brick house consisted of just a few small rooms clustered around an open courtyard with a roof of palm logs and thatch that let in the scorching sun and the frigid night air. Furniture was minimal, consisting of a low stool, a wooden headrest, and some woven reed mats for sleeping on the packed dirt floor. Rodents, scorpions, and snakes often crept in through the crevices. Hygiene and sanitation were poor, with garbage and human waste piling up in fetid heaps that attracted insects and disease. Most people had only a single linen garment to wear until it rotted off their backs. The diet for the lower classes was also sparse and monotonous, with bread and beer forming the cornerstone of most meals, accompanied by some vegetables like onions, lentils, and radishes. Meat was a rare luxury. Malnutrition left people vulnerable to a host of afflictions, including anemia, scurvy, and bone deformities. Parasites like roundworm and tapeworm were almost universal, and arthritis, tuberculosis, and abscesses ravaged weakened bodies. Physical evidence from common cemeteries reveals the harsh toll of this excruciating daily existence. Life was especially brutal for ancient Egyptian women, who had very little autonomy or agency of their own. Women were essentially considered the property of their fathers or husbands, to be disposed of in marriage as soon as they reached puberty. They had no rights to own property, initiate a divorce, or live independently. Their primary value was in their fertility and ability to bear children, preferably sons, for their husbands. Many girls became mothers as young teens, risking death in childbirth. A woman unable to bear children was often cast out. Child mortality was so high that many Egyptians didn't name their babies for weeks, fearing attachment to a child who might die. Perhaps 1 in 3 infants died before their first birthday due to disease, accidents, and malnutrition. Young children had to grow up quickly to avoid the same fate. As soon as they could walk and carry a load, they were put to work in the home and fields to contribute to the family's survival. Most had no opportunity for schooling and followed their parents into lives of poverty and toil. Eventually, even the grandeur of mighty pharaohs crumbled to dust, plundered by the depravity of their descendants. Public executions, where suspected tomb robbers were brutally impaled, or had their noses and ears cut off before being staked out in the sun to die, became more frequent as the kingdom declined. Corruption, greed, and lawlessness disregarded the natural order, Mahat, which had sustained Egyptian civilization for millennia. Thus, ancient Egypt, that endlessly fascinating and romantic land that has captivated imaginations for centuries, was also a place of immense brutality and human suffering on a massive scale. The price of magnificent monuments and golden treasures was paid by countless oppressed, uneducated, and sickly subjects whose voices are largely lost to history. Life for most was a constant struggle against hunger, disease, injustice, and untold hardships. Despite the oppressive circumstances, the ancient Egyptians endured, finding small joys and building families and friendships. They strived to uphold Ma'at and earn a blessed afterlife, all while in the shadow of their oppressors. Perhaps that is ancient Egypt's greatest legacy, the resilience of the human spirit to persist and achieve remarkable artistic and cultural feats despite overwhelming odds. Their people demonstrated that the will to organize and create can coexist with the capacity to exploit and destroy. This fragile beauty and meaning can be forged amidst chaos and suffering, much like the imperishable stars the Egyptians revered. Their works and wonders have endured across the ages, inspiring us today. Even as the harsh reality that birthed them fades into distant history and half-remembered dreams, childhood in ancient Egypt was a precarious existence. Infant and child mortality rates were tragically high, with many children not surviving to adulthood. Archaeologists often find the skeletons of children among the most common remains, a grim testament to the frequency of early death. Malnutrition was a constant threat, exacerbated by limited food variety and occasional famines that stunted growth and left children vulnerable to illnesses. Infectious diseases like smallpox, tuberculosis, and pneumonia, as well as intestinal parasites from impure water and contaminated food, claimed countless young lives. Without vaccinations or antibiotics, even minor cuts or everyday infections could quickly prove fatal to a child. Accidents were another common cause of death, occurring in a world of open cooking fires, unprotected wells, free-roaming livestock, and dangerous wildlife. Drownings, falls, burns, and animal attacks added to the litany of hazards. For those children who survived infancy, the specter of death still loomed large. Ancient Egyptian parents were intimately familiar with the grief of burying a child, often elaborately preparing their graves with carefully crafted grave goods. Miniature coffins and even mummification serve as poignant reminders of the profound emotional devastation caused by the loss of a son or daughter. Some families endured the excruciating pain of losing multiple children. It is believed that many Egyptians engaged in frequent pregnancies to ensure the survival of at least some offspring. children were considered a safeguard against the harsh realities of their time. However, there was limited time to provide shelter or care for children, despite the parents' deepest desires. The demands of daily survival necessitated that children be put to work at an early age, assisting their parents with household chores, agricultural tasks, or learning a trade or craft. For peasant children, this often entailed backbreaking labor in the fields or tending livestock in perilous conditions. Children of artisans would toil alongside their parents in hot, dusty workshops. Even for children of nobility, the responsibilities and expectations of their status limited the duration of their childhood. The exception was royal children, and even then, their childhood was brief. Princes and princesses enjoyed lives of abundance and privilege, accompanied by servants and slaves who catered to their every need. They had time for play in school, where they learned to read, write, and excel in subjects such as mathematics, science, geography, and foreign languages, preparing them for the duties of leadership. Nevertheless, royal children also faced strict discipline, rigid social norms, and high expectations. In particular, a royal son was expected to undergo rigorous training as a military commander and fulfill all the functions of kingship. Any physical or character flaw could jeopardize his prospects. For instance, the crown prince Patepsus is believed to have lost his position due to his indiscretion with a royal concubine. Royal daughters, on the other hand, spent their childhood largely preparing for marriage, either to a brother, half-brother, or carefully chosen noble to strengthen the dynastic line and political alliances. While they could become powerful queens in their own right, their path was still closely prescribed, and even royal children were not immune to the health hazards of the time. For instance, Tutankhamun's tomb contained 2 mummified fetuses believed to be his prematurely born daughters. As in many ancient societies, childhood was a luxury that most Egyptians could not afford. Growing up was less of a nurturing journey and more of a survival gauntlet against numerous dangers, demanding an early maturity. This stark reality makes the incredible accomplishments of the Egyptian people even more remarkable. Their ability to build such a sophisticated civilization in the face of relentless hardship is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. While ancient Egyptians had some remedies to alleviate suffering, medical treatment was still a gruesome and terrifying prospect for most. Without the benefit of modern science, they relied on a combination of practical observation, trial and error, and spiritual beliefs to address injuries and diseases. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating back to around 1600 BC, offers a sobering glimpse into the realities of ancient Egyptian medicine. This remarkable document details 48 surgical cases, each accompanied by clinical notes on injuries, diagnoses, treatments, and prognoses. The cases range from gaping head wounds to fractured collarbones to crushed vertebrae. It serves as both a pioneering work of empirical medicine and a horrifying record of the suffering endured by ancient patients. In one particularly graphic case, a patient suffered a severe compound fracture of the skull, accompanied by cranial debris and exposed brain matter. The unnamed surgeon meticulously describes his examination, thrusting his fingers into the opening and probing the wound. He notes the fluttering and crackling sensation beneath his fingertips. With admirable honesty, he records his judgment, stating that the ailment was not treatable for this unfortunate patient. The injury was deemed too catastrophic for intervention. Other treatments described in the papyrus and other medical texts were equally harrowing. Broken bones were set with wooden splints, wounds stitched with linen thread or bronze wire, and lacerations cleaned with copper salts, which had antiseptic properties. However, there was no understanding of germs, so no sterile technique was used, making infection a constant risk. Cauterization with red-hot irons was a common method for stopping blood loss and sealing wounds, but it was a horribly painful process. For internal ailments, Egyptian physicians prescribed a variety of potions, picasses, and purges made from herbs, minerals, and animal products. Moldy bread was applied to infections, a primitive form of antibiotic, while honey was used as a salve for cuts and burns. Raw meat was packed into open wounds to promote healing, and onions and garlic were consumed to boost health. Despite these treatments, many were misguided and based more on superstition than science. Leeches and bloodletting were believed to purge the body of unbalanced humors, and incantations and appeals to deities were recited in the belief that sickness was divine punishment. Animal dung was a popular ingredient in many remedies. It's sobering to think of the agony patients endured for treatments that likely only worsened their condition. Surgery, though rudimentary, was a well-established practice. Ancient Egyptian medical instruments included bronze scalpels, obsidian blades, bone saws, probes, forceps and scissors, which allowed for surprisingly complex procedures like craniotomies, cataract removals, and dental extractions. However, major surgeries were performed without anesthesia, and patients were held or tied down, biting on leather straps in agony. At best, they may have been knocked unconscious or intoxicated with alcohol. Opium poppy extract may have provided some post-operative pain relief for those who survived the procedure. Despite the best efforts of skilled physicians, many patients succumbed to complications, shock, and sepsis. Mummified remains reveal the scars of various medical interventions, from healed fractures to cranial boreholes and amputations. These were the fortunate ones; uncountable others undoubtedly perished on the operating tables of ancient Egypt. While ancient Egyptian medicine was advanced for its time, laying the groundwork for later Greco-Arabic medical traditions, its limitations resulted in significant unnecessary suffering. In a world devoid of germ theory, antibiotics and pain management, even minor injuries and illnesses were a source of dread. The fear of a toothache, a broken bone, or an infected cut was entirely justified. In ancient Egypt, being sick or injured meant being entirely at the mercy of primitive medicine. For all but the luckiest patients, treatment was as brutal as the underlying condition. This reality was inescapable, even for the wealthiest and most powerful. As we contemplate these grim aspects of ancient Egyptian life, it's crucial to remember that this was the daily existence for millions of people over thousands of years. Despite the unimaginable adversity, the accomplishments of this great civilization, from the majestic pyramids to the sophisticated irrigation systems to the exquisite artistic works, were achieved. The Egyptians lived, loved, created, and endured. Despite the constant specter of disease, injury, violence, oppression, and loss, their tenacity in building a society of such grandeur and resilience is awe-inspiring. However, we must be cautious not to romanticize this resilience. The hardships of ancient Egyptian life were not noble or empowering; they were tragic and often needlessly cruel. The majority of people lived in grinding poverty, with few rights or freedoms, constantly threatened by sickness, hunger, and mistreatment. That they persevered is a testament to the human will to survive, but it does not negate the injustice of their circumstances. In the study of ancient history, it's easy to be captivated by the grand narratives of kings and conquests, the dazzling artifacts and architectural wonders. However, we must also acknowledge the darker undercurrents, the stark inequalities, the casual brutality, and the precariousness of life for the masses. Only then can we truly appreciate the full extent of the human experience across the ages. The story of ancient Egypt, therefore, is not just one of monumentality and mystery. It is also a story of struggle and striving in the face of often overwhelming odds. It serves as a reminder that behind every great achievement lie countless untold tales of hardship and perseverance. The Egypt we admire today was built on the suffering of millions who toiled, endured, and held onto hope for a better life under the relentless sun. As we conclude our exploration of the darker aspects of ancient Egyptian history, we are left with a profound sense of perspective. The grandeur of the civilization takes on a new poignancy when balanced against the grim realities faced by its people. Their lives, by our modern standards, were often brutish and short. Yet they endured generation after generation to build a society of such enduring influence and fascination. Perhaps the greatest lesson we can glean from this exploration is one of empathy and humility. It's easy to judge the past through the lens of our present sensibilities and knowledge. However, to truly comprehend a civilization, we must strive to see the world as they did, with all their fears, beliefs, limitations, and aspirations that shaped their choices and actions. In the end, the ancient Egyptians were not so different from us. They were people striving to make sense of their world, to find meaning and joy in the face of hardship, and to leave a mark upon the shifting sands of time. Their triumphs and their tragedies echo across the millennia, reminding us of the shared humanity that unites us across the ages. Let us remember the ancient Egyptians not only for their pyramids and pharaohs, but also for their remarkable resilience in the face of relentless adversity. We should marvel at their ingenuity and artistry while acknowledging the suffering that often accompanied it. Approaching their history with empathy and respect for the countless nameless souls who lived, struggled, and died along the Nile's winding course enriches our understanding of the past, our appreciation for the present, and our hopes for the future. For as long as humans have walked this earth, we have faced hardships and found ways to overcome them. This eternal cycle of struggle and resilience is the very essence of our shared story, with ancient Egypt playing a profound and enduring part. As we conclude our journey through the darker annals of Egyptian history, let our dreams be haunted not by the specters of suffering, but illuminated by the eternal light of the human spirit that shone brightly in the land of the pharaohs. By confronting the shadows of the past, we emerge with a fuller understanding of the radiance of human resilience. The life of a slave in ancient Egypt was a brutal existence, characterized by back-breaking labor, meager rations, and the constant threat of punishment or death. Slaves were considered the property of their masters to be used and disposed of as they saw fit. Most were captives taken in wars with neighboring lands like Nubia to the south, while others fell into debt bondage, forced to toil endlessly to repay loans. Fortunately, some slaves worked as domestic servants in the households of the wealthy, where conditions were somewhat better. However, the vast majority of slaves labored in the fields from dawn to dusk, planting, tending, and harvesting crops along the Nile. In the scorching Egyptian sun, grueling work awaited the slaves. Cruel taskmasters pushed them to their limits, wielding whips to maintain control and productivity. Perhaps the worst fate for a slave was to be conscripted into forced labor on the pharaoh's massive building projects. Teams of slaves, joined by peasants, constructed the colossal pyramids that still dominate the Egyptian landscape today. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built for Pharaoh Khufu around 2580 BC, stands as a breathtaking marvel of engineering and human toil. Hundreds of thousands labored for decades to construct this tomb for the god-king to enjoy in the afterlife. Khufu, also known as Cheops, was the son of Neferu and the second pharaoh of the 4th dynasty. By all accounts, he was a megalomaniac obsessed with building the largest pyramid ever, standing over 480 feet tall and composed of 2.3 million blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons. The Great Pyramid was the tallest man-made structure in the world for 3,800 years. The logistics alone were staggering, but Khufu was relentless in his vision. He conscripted a labor force of over 100,000 from across Egypt, including slaves, farmers, skilled artisans, and craftsmen. All were expendable resources to be used up in service of the pharaoh's vanity. Working conditions were abysmal. Laborers toiled in gangs to cut, transport, and stack the huge limestone blocks in the searing heat. Skeletons found in the worker cemetery reveal signs of arthritis, spinal deformities, and other crippling injuries. Many died on the job from accidents, malnutrition, and sheer exhaustion. They were simply discarded in shallow graves in the sand. As a divine ruler, Khufu never gave a thought to the human cost of his self-indulgence. He and the elite enjoyed lives of luxury and leisure, while slaves and commoners broke their bodies to build the king's glorious tomb. This stark disparity between the classes was a fact of life in ancient Egypt. Other pharaohs were equally obsessed with monumentality, disregarding the human misery it entailed. Sneferu Khufu's father constructed 3 pyramids, serving as dress rehearsals for his son's grandest creation. The first, the Meidum Pyramid, was a stepped structure that the pharaoh decided to encase in limestone to achieve smooth sides. However, the unstable substrate led to its collapse during construction, likely resulting in the deaths of numerous workers. Undeterred, Senferu embarked on another attempt with the bent pyramid at Dashur. Named for its unusual angle, this peculiar edifice was another design failure. The king ordered the pyramid built on unstable ground, causing the base to sink during construction. Panicked architects reduced the incline angle from 54 degrees to 43 degrees halfway up, creating the distinctive bent shape. Once again, an unknown number of slaves perished. Finally, Nefaru succeeded with the Red Pyramid, named for the rusty hue of its limestone casing. Standing at 341 feet, it was a substantial structure, though it would be dwarfed by Khufu's later Colossus at Giza. The Red Pyramid served as a functionality complex, but the pharaoh was not yet satisfied. He needed one last rehearsal before passing the reins to his successor. Consequently, the aged king commanded yet another pyramid to be built beside the bent pyramid at Dashur, now known as the Black Pyramid. Very little remains of this enigmatic structure. Some Egyptologists believe it was abandoned when Neferu finally passed away. His grandiose vision remained unfinished as his consciousness journeyed toward the afterlife. In total, Senfu may have compelled nearly 1 million souls into forced service to construct these monuments to his vanity. The number of lives crushed by blocks, broken by falls, or ravaged by disease and deprivation is impossible to determine. However, no price in blood was too high for the whims of the living God. Such was the fate of the average Egyptian. While slaves had essentially no rights, the peasant class was only marginally better off. Farmers, while not outright owned, were still under the absolute authority of the king and compelled to labor for the state for a portion of the year. During the annual Nile flooding season, known as Akhet, gangs of peasants were conscripted by royal decree to work on irrigation projects, dredge canals, and fortify dikes. When the king demanded their labor, farming families' fields went untended, resulting in lower crop yields. These yields were already heavily taxed by the state. This precarious cycle left most commoners on the brink of subsistence, constantly fearing a bad flood, pest infestation, or poor harvest that could plunge them into destitution and hunger. Desperate peasants resorted to selling themselves into debt servitude when times were too tough. A loan of seed grain or a few livestock could lead to a life of indentured service and misery, with entire families enslaved to pay off ever-increasing interest to landowners and money lenders. The wealthy also sometimes enslaved children outright, shattering families. Punishments for slaves who displeased their masters were brutal. Beatings, brandings, and mutilations were common for minor offenses. Those who attempted escape faced execution in various horrific ways, including impalement, beheading, burning alive, or being fed to Nile crocodiles as a warning to others. Their bodies were often displayed publicly as a macabre message. Despite the cruelty, enslavement, subjugation, and lack of freedom, Egyptian slaves and peasants endured. They raised families, shared stories, sang songs, and made the best of their challenging circumstances. The incredible monuments and wonders of this remarkable civilization were built on their scarred backs and calloused hands. For this, if nothing else, they should be remembered, the faceless, toiling masses, whose suffering birthed a legacy of greatness. As we conclude our exploration of ancient Egyptian life, we witness a society characterized by stark contrasts. It boasts breathtaking wealth, artistry, and accomplishments, yet it is built upon layers of exploitation and human bondage. Tyrant god-kings, consumed by their own immortality, remain oblivious to the mortality of their subjects. Despite their mathematical and engineering marvels, this complex civilization fails to grasp the fundamental concepts of human rights and dignity. In many ways, ancient Egypt stands as a dazzling testament to human achievement, innovation, and sheer audacity. However, its foundations were laid in blood and nurtured by the tears of countless oppressed souls. This dualistic truth demands our acknowledgement and moral reckoning with the past. Only by embracing both the light and shadow can we truly comprehend this endlessly captivating culture. With this thought, we bid farewell to our exploration. I hope this journey through history has been both enlightening and restful. These ancient tales possess a dreamlike quality, inviting us to contemplate the eternal cycles of the human experience as we drift into slumber. If you've enjoyed this gentle exploration of ancient Egyptian life, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to this channel. Thank you for joining me on this tranquil journey to a distant age. May your dreams be filled with wonders and your sleep be restful and rejuvenating. Good night.